Hey everyone, tonight the story begins with something so ordinary that it is probably sitting somewhere in your kitchen right now. Salt. A few pale grains do not look like treasure. They do not shine like gold, decorate a crown, or fill the locked chest of a king. Most of us barely notice them. We reach for salt, use what we need, and put it back without wondering how it arrived there. For much of history, things were not quite so simple. Salt could preserve meat through winter. It could help fish survive a long journey inland. It could support armies, enrich merchants, shape roads, fill royal treasuries with tax revenue, and tempt smugglers onto dark paths at night. In some places, after traveling far enough from its source, it could become astonishingly valuable. So if these quiet journeys into the past help you relax, feel free to subscribe or leave a comment telling everyone where you're listening from. For now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Let the room grow quiet and allow the present day to drift a little farther away. Tonight, there will be no need to hurry. Our journey will move slowly through dark mines and smoky kitchens, along Roman roads and medieval market streets, past shallow salt pans shining beneath the sun, and eventually across the enormous silence of the Sahara, there will be merchants, miners, cooks, tax collectors, smugglers, kings, and many ordinary people whose names were never written down. All of them will be connected by the same small white crystal. The story is often reduced to one memorable claim. Salt was once worth more than gold. It sounds wonderful. It is also too simple. There was never one universal moment when every handful of salt became more valuable than the same weight of gold. A miner standing beside an enormous salt deposit would have understood value very differently from a merchant who had carried salt for weeks into a region where supplies were scarce. That difference is the real story. Value depends on place. It depends on distance. It depends on labor. And most of all, it depends on need. Gold can sit quietly inside a chest for generations. Salt is purchased so that it can disappear into meat, into fish, into cheese, into the bodies of people and animals. Its usefulness destroys the evidence of its presence. Perhaps that is why its old importance now feels so strange. Modern abundance has made salt boring. History made it powerful. And so tonight, before there are empires, taxes, smugglers, or desert caravans, the story begins somewhere colder. Morning is approaching a lake in the Austrian Alps. Mist rests over dark water. Forested slopes disappear into low cloud. High above the shore, a few workers are already awake. Their clothes are practical and worn. Their tools are simple. Their breakfast, if they have eaten one, is nothing worth describing in a royal chronicle. They are not going to war. They are not meeting a king. They are going to work ahead of them. An opening leads into the mountain. Inside, there is darkness. Timber, stone, cold air, and something hidden in the earth that other people need badly enough to make all this labor worthwhile. One worker adjusts what he is carrying. Then he steps toward the entrance. The daylight narrows behind him. A small flame reveals the first few feet of the passage. Beyond that, there is only blackness, and somewhere inside that blackness is salt. The small flame moves deeper into the mountain. Behind it walks a man carrying tools. Morning still rests over the lake outside, but here the daylight has already disappeared. The passage narrows. Timber supports interrupt the rough walls. The air smells of damp earth, wood, smoke, and bodies that have spent too many hours working underground. This is Hallstatt in the Austrian Alps. Long before Rome becomes an empire, people are already drawn to this valley by something hidden inside the mountain. Salt. To the worker entering the darkness, however, it does not look like treasure. It looks like another day. He reaches the place where work will begin. A tool rises, then strikes. The sound travels farther than the light. Another strike follows, then another. Mining is repetition. Raise, strike, move, strike again. The salt-bearing material does not care that people outside need what it contains. It does not loosen itself for merchants. It does not climb neatly into a basket. Every useful piece begins with labor. Someone must cut timber for the mine. Someone must repair tools, someone must prepare food for the workers, someone must carry supplies, someone must move the material toward daylight. Before salt enters a market, it has already created a small economy around itself. This is one of the quiet rules of history. No important commodity exists alone. Grain requires fields and harvesters. Iron requires mines, furnaces, fuel, and smiths. Cloth requires animals or plants, spinners, dyers, and weavers. Salt requires people willing to go where nature has placed it. At Hallstatt, that means entering the mountain. The work is difficult enough that every load leaving the darkness carries an invisible amount of human effort with it. Yet effort alone does not explain why anyone wants the mineral. The answer waits far beyond the mine: food spoils. An animal slaughtered in autumn provides more meat than a household can eat immediately. Fish begin changing soon after they leave water. Milk does not remain fresh because a family wishes it would. In a world without mechanical refrigeration, time is always present in the kitchen. Food is not merely something to obtain, it is something to keep. People learn many ways of doing this: drying, smoking, fermenting, salting. Methods overlap, and knowledge develops through experience rather than modern scientific explanation. A household does not need to know the language of microbiology to understand that meat treated one way lasts longer than meat treated another. Failure teaches quickly. Spoiled food smells wrong, looks wrong, feels wrong, and during a hard winter, wasted food can become dangerous. Salt helps people carry abundance forward. That may be its most important ancient power. It does not create food. It cannot rescue a harvest that never grew. It cannot fill an empty storehouse. But when food is available now and needed later, salt can help bridge the distance between those two moments. Salt is therefore not merely seasoning. It is time made manageable. Imagine an autumn household somewhere beyond these mountains. Animals have spent the warmer months feeding. Winter is approaching. Keeping every animal alive requires fodder, and fodder requires labor and storage. Some animals are slaughtered. Now the household has meat, a great deal of it. The family can eat some fresh. The rest becomes a problem. Salt helps turn that problem into winter stores. The taste may be far stronger than a modern diner expects. That is not the main concern. The concern is whether food remains useful when the fields are cold. A household preparing meat is thinking about a future meal. The salt from Hallstatt participates in that future. The miner underground will never see it. This is how trade begins, connecting strangers. One person performs labor for someone whose face he will never know. The worker strikes the wall again. Material comes loose. Eventually, it begins moving toward the entrance. And then salt encounters its next problem: weight. Salt is heavy. Gold can hold extraordinary value in a very small quantity. A merchant can carry significant wealth without requiring an entire caravan of precious metal. Salt behaves differently. Move enough of it to supply distant communities, and transportation becomes a major part of the cost. A person carrying salt needs food. An animal carrying salt needs food. A cart requires a usable path. A wheel can break. Rain can turn a road into mud. Snow can close a mountain route. A river can help transport heavy goods, but only where the water leads somewhere useful. Every mile introduces another possibility for delay. Distance enters the price. This is the first clue to the famous claim that salt could once be worth more than gold. The claim sounds as though salt possessed one enormous universal value. It did not. Near a productive salt source, the mineral could be relatively abundant. Travel far from dependable supplies, and the same material could become far more expensive. The crystal remains the same. Geography changes around it. A merchant, therefore, does something important without manufacturing anything. He moves abundance towards scarcity. That movement creates value. The path away from Hallstatt becomes part of the commodity. A load begins descending through the landscape. The mountain is behind it now. Trees surround the route. The lake appears and disappears between slopes. Travel is slow. A load that seemed manageable near the mine becomes more irritating after several hours. The carrier learns every rise in the path. He notices every patch of mud. He notices weather. He notices places where an animal can rest. The modern traveler may admire the scenery. The merchant admires a reliable bridge. Commerce changes the way a person sees geography. A beautiful mountain is an obstacle if the path is poor. A dull river can be wonderful if it carries heavy cargo cheaply. A settlement becomes valuable because it offers food, shelter, storage, animals, customers, or information. The route itself begins accumulating knowledge. Travelers learn where to stop. They learn which paths become dangerous after rain. They learn where water is available. They learn where buyers gather. One journey becomes several. Several become routine. Routine becomes a trade route. This is how many roads begin, not with an emperor drawing a line across a map. With repeated need, salt moves outward. Other goods move inward. A merchant rarely wants to return with nothing if another profitable load can be found. Trade develops in both directions. One region has salt, another has grain, another has cloth, another has metal. No landscape produces everything its people desire. Exchange turns local differences into economic relationships. Eventually, the salt reaches a market. There are no bright signs, no polished floor, no neat row of identical packages. There are animals, baskets, pottery, tools, food, cloth, mud, smoke, and voices. A merchant brings out salt. A buyer examines it. The negotiation begins. The seller remembers the road. The buyer thinks about need. Between those two memories lies the price. If several merchants have arrived with salt, the buyer can bargain more confidently. If supply is scarce, the seller has more power. If weather has blocked another route, the price may rise. If a nearby source has produced well, it may fall. There is no single ancient price of salt. This matters. The ancient world is not one enormous market operating under one exchange rate. It is thousands of local markets imperfectly connected by people, animals, roads, rivers, and ships. Salt can be cheap in one place and expensive somewhere else at the same moment. This is why comparisons with gold must always include the question where and when and for whom. A gold ornament beside a rich salt spring is still gold. A block of salt carried into a region with little local supply becomes something else economically. Not because people suddenly mistake it for precious metal, because they need it and replacement is difficult. The merchant is selling solved distance. Eventually, some of the salt changes hands. Perhaps the journey ends here. Perhaps another trader carries it farther. Each exchange makes Hallstatt more distant. The miner becomes invisible. The customer may know nothing about the mountain. He sees only salt. This is what commodities do. They hide their biographies. A loaf hides a field, a knife hides a furnace. A wool cloak hides sheep, spinners, and weavers. Salt hides rock, darkness, aching shoulders, timber supports, and the worker who struck the wall. Once the salt enters a household, even the merchant begins disappearing from the story. A hand takes some, it enters food, then it is gone. This is another difference between salt and gold. Gold is often valuable because it remains. It can be stored, displayed, inherited, hidden, melted and shaped again. Salt is valuable partly because people consume it. Its usefulness destroys the stock. A household buys salt, uses salt, then needs more salt, the demand returns. That repetition matters enormously. The miner must go underground again, the carrier must travel again, the merchant must return again. A necessity creates recurring trade. This is more economically dependable than a luxury purchased once and kept for decades. It also makes salt interesting to political authorities. Anything that moves repeatedly along recognizable routes can be watched. Anything widely purchased can potentially be taxed. A local ruler may charge a toll, a market may impose rules, a crossing may require payment. The first layers of authority begin attaching themselves to the commodity. Salt does not ask for government attention, its usefulness attracts it. Much later, rulers will turn this logic into elaborate systems. Monopolies, official prices, required purchases, inspectors, tax collectors, smugglers, punishments, all surrounding the same mineral that now sits quietly beside an ancient cooking fire, but that future remains far away. For the moment, Hallstatt is enough. Evening settles over the lake. The mine entrance darkens. Workers leave. Tools are put aside. The day has produced no famous battle. No king has died. No treaty has been signed. Nothing has happened that an ancient chronicler would necessarily consider worthy of a grand story, and yet something important has occurred. Salt has moved from geology into human society. Rock has become labor. Labor has become a commodity. The commodity has entered a road. The road has entered a market. The market has carried salt into a household. There it helps food survive. Then it disappears. Tomorrow the process begins again. This repetition is the foundation beneath the more dramatic stories that come later. Roman roads, desert caravans, royal taxes, smuggling, rebellion, they all depend on one fact already understood by the worker returning home beside the Alpine lake. People need salt badly enough to work for it, badly enough to carry it, badly enough to pay for it, and eventually badly enough for rulers to notice. Far to the south, another road is waiting. It runs toward a settlement beside the Tiber. In time, that settlement will become Rome, and the old route associated with bringing salt inland will acquire a name remembered long after the first merchants who walked it are gone. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Hallstatt grows quiet behind us. The mountain disappears into night, and the small white crystal begins moving toward an empire. Let us leave the dark Alpine mountain behind and follow the salt south, toward warmer hills and a river moving quietly toward the sea. Long before Rome becomes the center of an empire, people are already traveling through this landscape. They move animals, grain, pottery, metal, cloth, news, and salt. Near the mouth of the Tiber, coastal salt works provide access to a substance that communities farther inland continue to need. Between the coast and the settlements beyond it develops an old route associated with the movement of salt. Later generations know it as the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. The name sounds wonderfully deliberate, as though a Roman official once unrolled a map, drew a line across it, and announced that salt would travel there. Roads are rarely born so neatly. Often they begin as habits. Someone discovers a useful path, another person follows, animals pass over the same ground. Merchants remember the easiest crossing, travelers learn where water can be found, a path becomes familiar because people have a reason to keep using it. Necessity walks first. Government often arrives later. Imagine an early merchant traveling inland with salt. The morning is cool. His animals are loaded. The road ahead is not yet the magnificent engineered highway that later generations associate with Roman power. It is simply the route that works. That is enough. The merchant thinks about distance. He thinks about the condition of the load. He thinks about weather. Perhaps he thinks about a market several days ahead. He does not think about empire. His animal certainly does not. The animal thinks about weight. Salt is heavy. This remains one of the most important facts in its history. Gold can contain tremendous value in a small quantity. Salt demands space and muscle. Move enough of it, and transport becomes part of the price. The merchant therefore sees the landscape differently from a poet. A beautiful hill is an inconvenience if it makes the climb harder. A muddy path is an expense. A bridge is valuable. A river can be even more valuable if goods can travel by water. A reliable place to rest matters. A source of drinking water matters. The practical world of commerce is built from details too boring for monuments. Yet Rome itself will eventually depend on exactly these details. The settlement grows. More people gather near the Tiber. Buildings spread. Markets become busier. Political influence expands. Centuries pass. The small community becomes a city. The city becomes the center of a state. The state becomes an empire. And with every stage of growth, the same ordinary problem becomes larger. Everyone must eat. This sounds almost insulting in its simplicity. Rome gives history, emperors, generals, senators, philosophers, engineers, poets, rebels, and conquerors. Its surviving ruins encourage the imagination toward marble, temples, baths, amphitheaters, triumphal arches. But marble does not feed anyone. A city with a large population consumes enormous quantities of ordinary goods. Grain must arrive, oil must arrive, wine must arrive, animals must arrive, fuel must arrive, salt must arrive. A large city is a machine for consuming landscapes beyond its walls. Fields far away become Roman bread. Olive groves become Roman oil. Coastal fisheries become Roman meals. Salt works become part of Roman kitchens. The people eating these things may never meet the people who produced them. This is the same anonymity we saw at Hallstatt, now expanded to a much greater scale. Rome depends on strangers. The city may feel powerful and self-contained, but its appetite reaches outward every morning. Ships become essential, warehouses become essential, ports become essential, roads become essential, so do clerks. Someone has to count, someone has to record, someone has to inspect, someone has to unload, someone has to move sacks from one place to another. Someone has to repair the cart whose wheel breaks at exactly the wrong moment. Behind imperial Rome stands another Rome rarely carved into stone, a Rome of ropes, barrels, sacks, animals, mud, sweat, storage rooms, dock workers, merchants, and paperwork. Salt belongs to this less glamorous city. It also belongs to the Roman army. The legionary is remembered while marching. Armor catches the light. Standards rise above the formation. The road disappears beneath thousands of feet. But soldiers spend far more time not fighting than fighting. They march, they build, they dig. They stand guard, they repair equipment, they wait, and every day they need food. An army that cannot feed itself is not impressive for very long. Military supply therefore becomes one of the quiet foundations of Roman power. Grain must move, animals need fodder, clothing wears out, boots wear out, weapons require maintenance, tools break, men become sick. Everything consumed must eventually be replaced. The farther an army moves from established sources of supply, the more difficult the problem becomes. Salt participates in this system partly because preservation makes certain foods easier to store and transport. Fresh fish has a short argument with time. Time usually wins. Salt changes the argument. Meat also begins changing after slaughter. Salt can help extend its useful life. This does not make preserved food immortal. A badly stored product can still fail. Moisture still matters. Containers still matter. Temperature still matters, but preservation gives transport more time. And time creates distance. A fish that would spoil before reaching an inland customer may travel farther after preservation. Meat can remain useful longer. A military supply network gains flexibility. A merchant gains a larger potential market. A household gains storage. Salt has no gears and no wheels. Yet in this sense, it behaves like a technology. It changes what people can do with food. The Roman world becomes famous for salty and fermented fish products. Among them are sauces associated with the name garum. The exact products and terminology vary, but fish sauces become an important part of Roman food culture. Their production turns fish, salt, time, and skill into something that can be traded. The process is not especially romantic. A fish processing area can smell exactly as one would expect, a place full of fish and fermentation to smell. Ancient economic success does not always have a pleasant perfume. This is worth remembering when imagining Rome. The city is not a polished film set. It is alive. Animals move through streets. Waste exists. Workshops create smoke. Markets produce scraps. People shout. Carts make noise. Food smells. Human beings crowd into limited space. The empire may be magnificent from a distance. At street level, someone is still stepping around mud. Salt enters this noisy world quietly. A cook takes some. A seller weighs some. A merchant stores some. A producer of preserved fish needs much more. An official may care about how it is supplied or sold. And somewhere in this practical world appears a Latin word that will create one of the most persistent salt stories in history: salarium. The term is historically connected with salt. Much later, through the development of language, it contributes to the English word salary. That connection is real. Then the story becomes wonderfully simple. Roman soldiers, people say, were paid in salt. The image is difficult to resist. A line of legionaries waits after a long campaign. An officer approaches. Instead of coins, each man receives his valuable portion of salt. Perhaps a good soldier earns plenty. Perhaps a lazy one is not worth his salt. Everything fits so neatly that the story seems as though it must be true. History is often suspicious of stories that fit too neatly. Roman soldiers received monetary pay. Coins were central to military compensation. The details changed over Rome's long history, and deductions or allowances could complicate what a soldier actually received. But the popular image of ordinary legionary wages being regularly handed out as physical salt is not supported as a general practice. The connection between salarium and salt is more subtle. The precise development of the word has been debated. It may have involved an allowance or payment associated in some way with salt or expenses. What the evidence does not justify is transforming that uncertainty into a universal Roman salt paycheck. The myth survives because it explains too much in too little space. Salt was valuable. Salarium sounds connected to salt. Salary comes from salarium. Therefore, soldiers were paid in salt. A real linguistic relationship becomes a dramatic economic claim. This is how historical myths grow. They often begin with something true. Then the cautious words disappear. Perhaps becomes, certainly, may have becomes did. A complicated explanation becomes a sentence easy enough to repeat at dinner. Salt attracts these stories because modern people find its former importance surprising. Today it is cheap. Therefore, a story in which soldiers receive it as valuable wages creates a satisfying contrast. But salt does not need the myth to be important. Its real role is quieter. Imagine a soldier sitting beside a fire. The day's march is finished, his feet hurt. A strap needs repair. Someone nearby complains about an officer. Someone else is preparing food. There is nothing heroic about the moment. A meal appears. Salt enters without ceremony. The soldier eats. That is enough. Multiply this ordinary meal across camps, towns, ships, households, workshops, and generations. The scale becomes enormous. Salt matters through repetition: one meal, then another one, preserved fish, then another one, shipment, then another. This is more important than a picturesque bag of salt handed out as wages. Necessities gain power because demand returns. A person may buy an expensive ornament once, salt is consumed, then more is needed. A household empties its supply. A merchant returns. The producer works again. The road remains active. Repeated demand is attractive, not only to merchants, it attracts governments. Rome becomes increasingly sophisticated at organizing territory, taxation, markets, roads, and supplies. The relationship between Roman authorities and salt varies across periods and should not be reduced to one permanent rule. But the broader logic is already visible. If a commodity is widely needed, its movement matters. If its movement can be controlled, revenue may be collected. If supply becomes politically important, authorities have a reason to pay attention. Salt is therefore slowly approaching another stage in its history: power. The merchant sees salt as profit. The cook sees an ingredient. The soldier sees food. The producer sees labor. The government sees supply and potential revenue. The same crystal carries several meanings at once. This may be the most useful way to understand value. Value does not sit entirely inside an object. It exists between the object and the circumstances around it. Place gold in the hands of a thirsty traveler alone in a desert, and its practical usefulness becomes limited. Place water there, and the calculation changes immediately. Put salt beside a productive salt source, and it may be ordinary. Carry it into a region where supply is difficult and demand is strong, and the price can rise dramatically. Nothing inside the salt has changed. Circumstances have. Roman merchants understand this without needing modern economic textbooks. Buy where something is easier to obtain, carry it toward people who want it more. Sell it if the difference in price justifies the journey. The profit pays for distance and risk. Sometimes the journey fails, a ship sinks, goods are stolen, an animal dies, a market is already full. A political conflict closes a route. A merchant discovers that someone else arrived first with the same commodity. Trade is not automatic wealth, it is uncertainty carried along a road. Rome reduces some forms of uncertainty through infrastructure. Roads improve movement. Political control can make certain routes more predictable, although violence and theft never disappear. Ports and cities create concentrated markets. Information travels through commercial networks. The empire becomes a vast space in which goods move across remarkable distances. Salt is only one commodity among many, but it has an advantage. People keep needing it. Even wealthy Romans surrounded by luxury remain biological creatures. Their bodies require salt, their kitchens use it, Their food systems depend on preservation and processing. Power cannot escape ordinary needs. An emperor may possess more gold than a laborer will see in a lifetime. Both still have to eat. That quiet equality does not make Roman society equal. Far from it. Wealth determines the quality, variety, security, and abundance of food available to different people. The rich can obtain luxuries from distant places. The poor live much closer to the edge of necessity. A price increase that barely troubles a senator can matter greatly to a laboring household. This difference will become important when later governments place heavy taxes on salt. A necessity used by rich and poor can provide reliable revenue. But the burden does not feel the same to everyone. Rome will not be the final chapter in that story. Empires change. The Western Roman political system fragments. Cities transform. Some trade networks contract. Others continue in altered forms. Roads remain beneath new travelers. Languages change. Rulers change. The old Latin words themselves begin journeys into new languages. Salarium eventually helps give English its word salary. The empire disappears. The linguistic fossil remains. Salt remains too. That is one advantage of following an ordinary substance through history. Kings vanish faster than human needs. A dynasty may end. Meat still spoils. A government may collapse. Fish still needs preservation if it is going to travel far. A language may change. Winter still arrives. And so the road continues beyond Rome. Centuries pass. Now imagine Northern Europe. A wet path runs toward York. Another road approaches London. Across the Channel, towns in Flanders fill with merchants and craftsmen. Farther south, Normandy faces the sea. The architecture has changed. Clothing has changed. Political boundaries have changed. Christian religious practice shapes calendars, meals, and markets in ways unfamiliar to the ancient Roman soldier. But inside a household, an old problem remains. Autumn is ending. Winter is approaching. An animal has been slaughtered. There is too much meat to eat immediately. There is no refrigerator, no freezer, no machine capable of holding the food safely until spring. The family has smoke, dry air when weather permits, experience, containers, and salt. The Roman road fades behind us. The medieval hearth appears ahead. Smoke hangs beneath a timber roof. Rain strikes the ground outside. A piece of meat waits on a table. And the history of salt becomes, once again, the history of trying to make tomorrow's dinner survive tonight. Now we move from the old Roman road into a colder world. Rain falls outside York. It is not a dramatic storm. There is no thunder rolling over the fields, no violent wind tearing branches from trees. It is simply the kind of steady rain that turns paths into mud, darkens timber, and makes every journey feel longer than it should. Autumn is ending. Inside a small house, a fire burns beneath a smoke-darkened roof. Damp clothing hangs nearby. Wooden bowls sit on a rough table. A knife has been sharpened, containers have been cleaned and prepared, and there is meat. Too much meat for one meal, too much for tomorrow. The household faces one of the most ordinary problems of the medieval world. Food does not wait. There is no refrigerator humming quietly in a corner. There is no freezer. A cellar may remain cool, but cool storage cannot solve everything. Winter itself can provide low temperatures, but winter is unreliable. A freezing week may be followed by milder weather. Food begins changing from the moment an animal is slaughtered, a fish is caught, or milk leaves the animal. The family knows this without understanding bacteria in modern scientific language. Experience is enough. Food prepared one way lasts. Food prepared another way does not. A mistake can smell terrible. In a poor household, it can also become dangerous. Autumn makes the problem especially important because animals require fodder through winter. Hay must be cut, dried, carried, stored. Every animal kept alive continues consuming food. A household therefore has choices to make. Which animals should be maintained? Which are valuable enough to feed through the cold months? Which should be slaughtered before winter? The answer depends on land, wealth, weather, household size, and luck. When an animal is slaughtered, abundance suddenly arrives. Then the clock begins. Some meat can be eaten fresh, some can be dried, some smoked, some salted. These methods may be combined. The goal is not to create a fashionable meal. The goal is February. A person takes salt and begins working it into meat. The crystals touch damp hands. The movement is repetitive. Turn, rub, arrange. Check. Then continue. Salt helps draw moisture from food and creates conditions less favorable to many organisms responsible for spoilage. The medieval worker does not describe the process this way. There is no need. The household knows the result. Properly preserved meat can remain useful longer. That knowledge may have passed through generations without ever being written down. A child watches an adult. Later, the child helps. Eventually, the movements become familiar. How much salt? How should the meat be arranged? How long should it remain? Where should it be stored? What does a failed piece smell like? When should something be thrown away? The senses become instruments: sight, touch, smell, taste, memory. This is household science without a laboratory. Much of human knowledge has always traveled this way. Someone does something that works, someone else remembers. A mistake corrects the method. Years turn practice into tradition. Salt fits easily into this world because its usefulness can be observed. A family does not need a theory of microorganisms to notice that salted food lasts longer. The preserved meat may taste extremely salty by modern standards. That is not necessarily how it will be eaten. It can be soaked, boiled, combined with other foods. Some salt can be removed during preparation. The cook is not simply seasoning dinner. The cook is using salt as a tool. This difference is important. Modern kitchens often treat salt mainly as flavor. The medieval household also knows it as preservation. Salt is not merely making food taste better. It is helping food travel through time. Outside, the rain continues. A cart struggles toward York. Its wheels sink into soft ground. The driver encourages an unhappy animal forward. Inside the load are goods from places the household may never see. Trade makes distant landscapes appear in local markets. Grain carries a field, wool carries pasture, fish carries the sea, salt carries a coast, spring, mine, or boiling pan. A medieval market is an invisible map. The people walking through it may not think of geography. They think of prices. A merchant has salt, a buyer wants some. If supply is good, the price may be manageable. If weather has delayed transport, it may rise. If political conflict disrupts a route, the market notices. If a local source produces poorly, the market notices. The household experiences distant events as a number. Salt costs more today. This can be frustrating because the cause may be invisible. Information moves slowly. A traveler brings news. A merchant says another shipment has been delayed. A neighbor repeats something heard in town. Rumor travels along the same roads as goods. Sometimes it arrives first. The careful household stores what it can. Winter makes roads less dependable. A family with supplies already inside the house has some protection against uncertainty. Not complete protection. A roof can leak, a fire can destroy stores. Animals can get into food. Moisture can ruin something. War can sweep through a region. Disease can enter a household. A poor harvest can leave too little to preserve in the first place. Salt is not magic, it solves one problem. But one reliable solution can shape an entire economy. Now leave York for a moment and travel toward the coast. The air becomes sharper. Fishing boats move through cold water. Men work before sunrise. A successful catch brings fish aboard in large quantities. Success creates urgency. Fish spoils quickly. Some can be sold fresh near the coast. But what about customers inland? What about towns far from the sea? What about markets reached only after days of travel? Salt helps answer these questions. Herring becomes particularly important in northern European commerce. Preserved fish can travel much farther than fresh fish, but the fish cannot simply be covered in salt and thrown onto a cart. It requires processing. It requires containers. And this introduces another worker. The Cooper barrels are easy to ignore until one tries to run a pre-modern trade network without them. A useful barrel is a piece of technology. Wood must be selected, shaped, fitted, bound. The container has to survive movement. It must hold its contents well enough to justify the labor spent making it. A barrel of preserved fish therefore contains far more work than the fish itself. Fishermen, salt producers, processors, coopers, dock workers, sailors, Merchants, carters, market sellers, perhaps officials collecting tolls. The person eating the fish sees almost none of them. The commodity hides its workers. This pattern has followed us from Hallstatt. The farther goods travel, the easier it becomes to forget their origins. Religious life also helps shape demand for fish in medieval Christian Europe. Rules and customs concerning days when meat from land animals is avoided make fish important to many consumers. Practices vary by period and place, but the broader effect can be substantial. Religious calendars influence meals, meals influence markets. Markets influence fishing. Fishing influences demand for salt. The salt worker may never know why a particular merchant suddenly wants more. A decision made in one part of society becomes labor somewhere else. This is how complicated economies grow. No single person needs to understand the entire system. Everyone responds to the problem directly in front of them. The fisherman wants to preserve his catch. The merchant wants fish that survives transport. The household wants food. The salt seller wants payment. The cooper wants customers for barrels. Their separate decisions create a network. Across the channel, Flanders offers another example. Towns grow around trade and specialized production. Cloth becomes famous, but a weaver cannot eat cloth. The more people specialize in one kind of work, the more they depend on other people to provide everything else. A craftsman needs grain grown by someone else. A city household may depend on fuel brought from outside. Fish may arrive from the coast. Salt may travel from yet another region. Specialization creates efficiency. It also creates dependence. Salt helps support that dependence because preservation makes certain foods easier to move and store. London faces the same fundamental problem on a larger scale. As the city grows, nearby land alone cannot conveniently satisfy every need of its population. Food must arrive, fuel must arrive, animals must arrive. A city consumes the countryside around it and reaches beyond that countryside when necessary. Every urban meal becomes a small triumph of logistics. No trumpets announce it, a loaf simply appears at a stall. A fish reaches a kitchen. A piece of cheese is cut. Yet behind each object is a chain of people moving goods towards someone who cannot produce them personally. Cheese gives salt another quiet role. Milk is highly perishable. Transforming milk into cheese allows part of its nutritional value to be stored and transported in another form. Salt can contribute to the process. It affects flavor, moisture, texture, preservation. Again, it works as part of a system rather than as a miracle ingredient. The milk matters. The culture of microorganisms matters. Temperature matters. Skill matters. Time matters. Salt joins them. This repeated partnership explains much of its historical importance. Salt rarely acts alone. With meat, it works beside drying, smoking, careful storage, and cooking. With fish, it joins cleaning, packing, barrels, ships, and markets. With cheese, it becomes one part of a biological transformation learned through generations of practice. Salt is infrastructure. An infrastructure has an unfortunate habit of becoming invisible when it works. Gold wants to be seen. A gold object announces wealth. Salt performs its work quietly and disappears into food. This difference matters. Prestige is remembered because people display it. Necessity is forgotten because people use it. Winter continues. The household near York now has less food than it did in autumn. Every week makes the containers lighter. A hanging piece of meat grows smaller. Grain disappears. Cheese is cut again. Firewood is consumed. The family begins making calculations. Enough until when? This is where preservation reveals its true purpose. It is not about keeping food forever. It is about keeping food long enough. Long enough for the next market, long enough for the next season, long enough for a journey, long enough to cross the dangerous period between abundance and renewal. Late winter can be particularly difficult. The autumn harvest is now distant. New crops are not ready. Stores have been consumed for months. A poor household has little room for error. A wealthy household may purchase additional food if markets function. It may have larger stores, more land, more animals, more servants, more ways to respond when something goes wrong. The poor household cannot solve scarcity by opening another storeroom. This difference will matter greatly when rulers begin taxing salt. A government may look at salt and see an excellent source of revenue because nearly everyone needs it. But the same charge does not affect every household equally. A wealthy family may barely notice. A poor family may have to choose what not to buy. More money for salt can mean less for fuel, less for grain, less for another necessity. Taxes on ordinary goods enter ordinary rooms. That story is still ahead. For now, winter itself is enough of a tax. One evening, a piece of salted meat is taken from storage. It is prepared carefully, perhaps soaked first, then boiled with other ingredients. The meal is not luxurious. It may not even be especially pleasant, but there is food on the table. This is easy to underestimate from a world of refrigeration and constant supply. Repetition can be comforting when the alternative is hunger. The same meal again means there is a meal again. Salted herring again means something remains in the barrel. A hard piece of cheese means milk from an earlier season is still feeding someone now. Preservation turns memory into calories. Outside, the night is cold. The road is quiet. Then, gradually, the season begins to change. Water drips from roofs. The frozen ground softens. Daylight lasts longer. The first signs of spring appear. The household has crossed the winter. Perhaps comfortably, perhaps barely. Either way, much of the stored salt has disappeared. It entered meat, fish, cheese, cooking water, human bodies. The supply must eventually be replaced. This is why necessities create recurring trade. A gold ornament can remain in a chest. Salt has to be bought again. The merchant returns because the household returns. The producer works because consumption never truly ends. Spring opens the roads. Carts move more easily. Markets become busier. Another cycle begins, but our journey will not remain in the green fields of England. Follow the trade route south. Cross the Channel. Move beyond Normandy and the busy commercial world of Flanders. Continue toward the Mediterranean, then farther still. The climate changes. Rain becomes less dependable. Vegetation thins. The horizon grows wider. Soon, the damp road outside York feels like a memory from another planet. Ahead lies the Sahara. There, salt will no longer appear as a modest supply beside a winter hearth. It will appear in heavy blocks. Blocks large enough to load onto camels. Blocks cut from places where salt is so abundant that it can seem almost worthless. Then those blocks will begin moving, day after day, across distances where water matters more than money, toward markets connected to lands famous for gold. This is where the old claim about salt and gold becomes most dramatic. Not because every grain of salt suddenly becomes more valuable than precious metal, but because distance can transform abundance into scarcity. The medieval household near York has already taught us the first half of that lesson. Salt matters because people need what it can do. The Sahara will teach the second. Need becomes far more expensive when the nearest supply is hundreds of difficult miles away. The fire in the York household burns low. The last winter stores sit quietly in the shadows. Far to the south, another fire burns beneath a clearer sky. Beside it, merchants prepare ropes, water containers, and animals. Camels kneel on the ground. Heavy blocks wait to be loaded. The next road has almost no mud. It has a much more serious problem. It has almost no water. Let us leave the wet fields of northern Europe behind and travel south. Until the rain disappears almost completely, the green fades first, then the trees become fewer. Rivers grow more precious. The horizon opens. Eventually, the earth seems to stretch beneath a sky too large for it. This is the Sahara. At dawn, the desert can feel almost gentle. The night has left a little coolness behind. Long shadows lie across pale ground. A quiet wind moves between men and animals preparing for the day. The heat is coming. Everyone knows it. So the work begins early. Camels kneel while loads are checked. Ropes are tightened. Water containers are inspected. Food is counted. A merchant walks along the line looking at each animal. One camel makes a low, irritated sound. Another refuses to rise until encouraged. The camel is wonderfully suited to desert travel. This does not mean the camel is pleased about it. Among the loads waiting on the ground are blocks of salt. They are not elegant. They do not glitter. They are heavy enough to make their value seem almost inconvenient. This is the first great difference between salt and gold. A small quantity of gold can represent considerable wealth. Salt requires space. A merchant moving commercially useful quantities of it must devote animals, ropes, time, and labor to the task. Every block must justify its own weight, and every camel carrying salt must also survive the journey. Water must be carried, food must be considered, equipment must be carried. The caravan cannot load every available space with merchandise and hope that profit will solve thirst later. The desert does not accept gold as payment for water that is not there, so the caravan leader calculates. How far to the next reliable water? How much can each animal carry? How quickly can the group move without exhausting them? What happens if a container leaks? What happens if an animal becomes lame? What happens if the route takes longer than expected? Trade across the Sahara is arithmetic with consequences. A mistake in a market may cost money. A serious mistake here may cost a life. The caravan begins moving. One animal follows another. Feet press into sand, gravel, and hard ground. The Sahara is not simply an endless ocean of golden dunes. There are great dune fields, but there are also rocky plateaus, gravel plains, mountains, dry valleys, depressions, and enormous spaces where an inexperienced traveler may see very little that appears useful. A guide sees more. The angle of the sun matters. A distant ridge matters. The stars matter. The memory of a well matters. The shape of the land matters. A route learned from older travelers matters. Knowledge becomes a form of infrastructure. There are no stone milestones every convenient distance. No road signs, no comfortable inn appearing because evening has arrived. The route exists partly in memory. A good guide carries something lighter than salt and more valuable than almost anything in the caravan. He carries the way. By mid-morning, the cool air is gone. The heat begins pressing down. Conversation becomes less important. The travelers conserve effort. The camels settle into a steady pace. There is no advantage in exhausting the animals for the pleasure of arriving slightly earlier. Distance rewards patience. It also rewards boredom. A successful caravan journey can contain long stretches in which nothing dramatic happens. No attack, no catastrophic storm, no heroic rescue, no miraculous discovery, only walking. Then more walking. This is good. Nothing happening means the route is correct. The animals are still moving. The water remains inside its containers. The salt remains attached to the animals. In dangerous travel, boredom can be evidence of competence. The blocks sway with each step. Some may have come from desert salt mines, where the mineral is so abundant that calling it treasure would sound absurd. One place becomes especially famous in accounts of the medieval trans-Saharan salt trade, Tagaza. It lies in an extraordinarily harsh environment. Its importance comes from what can be extracted there. Salt, workers cut the mineral from the earth. Large slabs or blocks can be prepared for transport. Caravans arrive because distant markets want them. The surrounding landscape offers few comforts. Supplies have to be brought in. Water is difficult. Food must arrive from elsewhere. Yet people work there because geology has placed something valuable beneath an otherwise severe landscape. Holstadt had a cold mountain and a lake. Tagaza has desert. The economic principle is the same. A resource can make an unlikely place important. Historical descriptions of Tagaza include one detail that seems designed for storytellers. Salt is so abundant that blocks of it can be used in construction. Imagine standing beside a wall made partly from the same material merchants have crossed the desert to obtain. The image explains local value better than a page of theory. At the source, salt can be ordinary enough to build with. Far away, the same material can command a much higher price. Nothing about the salt itself has changed. Distance has. This is the central idea behind the old claim that salt could be worth more than gold. Salt did not possess one universal ancient price. There was no single market stretching across Africa in which everyone agreed that one weight of salt always equaled some fixed weight of gold. Markets differed, supply differed, demand differed, transport costs differed, political conditions differed. The comparison only makes sense when attached to particular places and circumstances. Near a salt mine, salt is abundant. Far from one, it can be scarce. The merchant earns money by carrying the commodity from the first condition into the second. He sells solved distance. The desert makes that solution expensive. A block arriving at a distant market contains more than mineral in its price. It contains camel labor, human labor, water, food, ropes, lost time, knowledge, risk. Perhaps taxes or payments along the route, perhaps the cost of animals that did not survive earlier journeys. The buyer sees salt, the price remembers the desert. Around midday, the caravan stops. The sun is too severe to ignore, loads are checked. One rope has loosened, a man tightens it. A water container is inspected, an animal is examined. Small problems are easier to solve while they are still small. This is the less romantic side of long-distance trade. Merchants spend a remarkable amount of time checking things: ropes, containers, feet, animals' loads, then checking them again. The dramatic bargaining scene at the end of the journey is possible only because someone noticed a loose rope several days earlier. When the caravan moves again, the horizon trembles in the heat. The line of animals appears tiny against the landscape. This scale is important. The desert is not merely empty space separating two markets, it shapes the trade itself. Water sources influence routes, political relationships influence safety. Knowledge of communities along the way matters. Animals determine how much can be carried, seasons matter. The caravan cannot simply draw a straight line across a map and follow it. Commerce bends around survival. Camels help make this system possible. Their ability to endure arid conditions gives merchants a transport animal remarkably suited to long desert journeys. But the familiar phrase "ship of the desert" can make the camel sound almost effortless. It is not. Camels need management. They can become sick, they can be injured, they can be overloaded, they can be stubborn. A badly loaded animal can develop problems that become serious far from help. Every camel represents both transport and investment. Lose one, and the caravan loses carrying capacity. Lose several, and goods may have to be abandoned. The merchant therefore watches the animals carefully. Salt does not walk away by itself. A camel might. Evening finally softens the heat. The caravan stops. People drink. Food is prepared. The animals rest. Above them, the sky becomes dark enough for stars. Far from large settlements, the night can seem almost impossibly clear. For people who understand how to use it, the sky is not only beautiful, it is information. Direction lives there. The stars become part of the route. On the ground, blocks of salt rest beside the animals. Place a piece of gold beside them, and most modern observers would choose the gold. The merchant might too. Gold is compact, it stores value efficiently, it is easier to carry. But the question changes when the salt reaches a place where people strongly need it and cannot easily obtain it locally. Value depends on circumstances. Farther south lie commercial networks connected to the Sahel and West Africa. Some regions are associated with significant gold production. Gold moves outward from those areas, salt moves toward them. The two commodities travel in opposite directions because scarcity points in opposite directions. Where salt is abundant, gold may be highly desirable. Where gold enters trade, salt may still be necessary enough to command a strong price. This creates one of the most famous images in African economic history: gold moving north, salt moving south, treasure meeting necessity. The reality is more complicated than a simple exchange of one block for another. Trans-Saharan trade involves many goods. Cloth travels, leather goods travel. Cola nuts participate in regional networks. Horses move through parts of the commercial system. Books and manuscripts travel. Tragically, enslaved people are also moved through these networks. Trade carries ideas as well: religious scholarship, languages, news, political information. A caravan is a moving connection between societies. Salt and gold become famous because the contrast between them is memorable. One is pale and heavy, the other bright and compact. One is consumed, the other can be stored. One is associated with necessity, the other with wealth and prestige. Yet a merchant cares less about poetry than price. If carrying salt south produces profit, salt moves south. If gold can be sold profitably in northern markets, gold moves north. Trade does not require symbolic meaning, it requires differences, differences in supply, differences in demand, differences in price. Political powers grow around these commercial networks. The medieval empires and kingdoms of West Africa participate in and benefit from trade across the region. Ghana becomes famous in historical accounts for its relationship with commerce, including gold. Later, Mali rises to extraordinary prominence. Names such as Timbuktu eventually become associated in the wider imagination with wealth, trade, scholarship, and the routes crossing the Sahel. But no merchant experiences an empire as a colored shape on a modern historical map. He experiences it through people, officials, taxes, security, markets, rules, languages, weights, local expectations. A stable political environment can make trade easier. A ruler able to protect routes and markets can benefit from commerce. Taxing goods passing through controlled territory can generate revenue without the ruler personally producing the goods. This is an important transformation. The miner creates salt. The caravan moves salt. The merchant sells salt. The political authority discovers that movement itself can be taxed. A road becomes a source of revenue. Salt therefore attracts power long before it reaches the kitchen. The same will happen repeatedly elsewhere. A king does not need to own every salt crystal. He only needs enough control over production, roads, markets, or borders to claim part of its value. The caravan resumes its journey the next morning. Days begin to blur. Wake, load, walk, rest, check water, walk again, unload, sleep, then repeat. The rhythm resembles the Hallstatt miner striking the mountain. Important systems are built from repetitive work. History remembers the arrival. The travelers remember the miles. Eventually, the environment begins changing. The deepest desert lies behind them. Signs of greater human activity appear. Vegetation becomes more noticeable. Markets draw closer. The salt has traveled far enough that its source now feels almost imaginary. A buyer seeing the block does not see Tagaza. He does not see the worker who cut it. He does not see the guide who watched the stars. He does not see the camel that carried it. He sees what he needs. This is the same disappearance we saw in Europe. Commodities hide their journeys, but the price does not forget. Distance remains inside it. A merchant enters a market. Goods are unloaded. People inspect the salt. Negotiations begin. Perhaps the buyer wants a lower price. The merchant knows what the journey cost. Perhaps another caravan has already arrived. Perhaps supply is plentiful. Perhaps demand is stronger than expected. No universal equation determines the exchange. This is where later stories can become dangerous. Accounts of salt being exchanged for enormous quantities of gold are repeated because they sound astonishing. Some medieval writers describe remarkable values and trading practices in West Africa. Such reports are valuable, but they must be read carefully. Writers may depend on information received from travelers. Conditions differ by location. Prices change. A striking comparison can become exaggerated as it is retold. The safest conclusion is not that salt everywhere in West Africa literally had a permanent value greater than gold. The safer and more interesting conclusion is that salt could become extremely valuable in regions where demand was strong and supply required difficult long-distance transport. That is enough. There is no need to turn every market into a fairy tale. Gold itself has different local value depending on access and demand. In a gold-producing region, the metal enters commerce from a point of relative supply. Carry it toward places where gold is scarcer and highly desired, and its value changes. The two commodities mirror one another. Salt moves away from abundance. Gold moves away from abundance. Merchants profit from the difference. This is why the famous comparison works best as a story about geography rather than a story about strange medieval priorities. People did not foolishly prefer seasoning to treasure, they understood need. A person who already has access to gold but lacks sufficient salt may value the next unit of salt more urgently than another piece of gold. A person surrounded by salt but eager for precious metal makes the opposite calculation. Value is relational. The market brings those relationships together. As evening arrives, the caravan's salt begins disappearing into new hands. Some will move farther. Some will enter households. Some may be used for food. Some for animals. Some for other practical purposes. The original caravan is no longer important to the buyer. Its work has become invisible. The merchants may now seek goods for the return journey. Gold is among the most famous possibilities. A small amount is easier to carry than the salt that came south. The contrast must be satisfying after weeks of watching camels struggle beneath heavy blocks. The return journey, however, is still a desert journey. Gold does not make water containers lighter. Wealth does not shorten the route. The Sahara remains indifferent. That indifference explains why the trade is impressive. The merchants do not conquer the desert. They learn how to move through it. They respect distance. They remember water. They manage animals. They rely on guides. They repeat successful routes until those routes become economic arteries connecting distant societies. Salt is one of the goods keeping those arteries active. Night settles over the market, somewhere nearby. A block that spent weeks crossing the desert has already been divided. Its journey as one object is ending. Soon it will disappear through use. Gold may remain visible for generations. Salt vanishes. Yet tomorrow, another caravan will begin loading. That is the quiet advantage of necessity. Consumption creates return. Return creates trade. Trade creates routes. Routes create markets. Markets attract rulers. And rulers eventually discover that the easiest way to profit from a necessary commodity may not be to carry it at all. It may be simply to stand beside the road and demand a share. The desert grows dark. Camels settle. Merchants count what remains. Far beyond them, gold waits in the commercial networks of West Africa. Our next journey follows the two commodities more closely toward the kingdoms and cities where their meeting becomes legendary. Salt has crossed the desert. Now it is about to meet gold. Now we follow the salt beyond the desert. The hardest miles are behind the caravan, but the journey of the commodity is not finished. The landscape has changed. There is more vegetation now. Settlements appear more often. The world no longer feels as though it might continue empty forever. People gather around markets. Languages mix. Animals arrive carrying goods from different directions. Merchants exchange news before they exchange merchandise. Some have traveled north, others south. Some know the desert, others know the forests and river systems farther below. Between them lies a commercial world far more complicated than the simple picture of salt going one way and gold going the other. Yet salt and gold remain the two goods that later generations remember most clearly. It is easy to understand why. The contrast is perfect. Salt is pale. Gold shines. Salt is bulky. Gold is compact. Salt is consumed. Gold can remain in a treasury for generations. Salt belongs to kitchens, animals, preservation, and ordinary biological need. Gold belongs easily to jewelry, prestige, diplomacy, political authority, and stored wealth. One seems boring, the other seems like treasure. And yet the boring one has just crossed the Sahara because people are willing to pay for it. This is where the old claim begins to sound almost believable. Salt, we are told, could be worth its weight in gold. Sometimes the claim becomes even larger. Salt was worth more than gold, but the market in front of us does not contain a sign announcing one permanent exchange rate. It contains people bargaining. That difference matters. A merchant looks at the salt, another looks at gold. Each thinks about what can be obtained elsewhere. Each thinks about the next journey. Each knows that a commodity valuable here may have a different value several weeks away. Price belongs to place. The medieval states of West Africa become deeply connected to this geography. Centuries before the rise of Mali, the Ghana Empire grows powerful in a region positioned to benefit from important trade networks. The name can be confusing to modern listeners. The medieval Ghana Empire was not simply the same territory as the modern country that carries the name Ghana. Its political center lay farther northwest. It became associated with control over trade and with access to the commercial movement of gold. Gold from regions farther south entered wider networks. Merchants carried goods across territory. Authorities could collect revenue from commerce. This is one of the oldest political discoveries in the history of trade. A ruler does not need to mine every valuable commodity personally. He needs control over the places where commodities move. A market can be taxed. A caravan can be taxed. Goods entering territory can be taxed. Goods leaving territory can be taxed. A road can become part of the treasury. Salt is perfect for this kind of world because its movement is visible. Large quantities are difficult to hide. A camel loaded with heavy salt blocks does not look innocent simply because the merchant whistles casually. The cargo announces itself. Gold presents the opposite problem. A small amount can contain enormous value. That makes control of the gold trade politically important and potentially difficult. Historical accounts suggest that rulers in the Ghana Empire benefited greatly from commerce passing through their realm. The exact systems changed over time, and surviving descriptions often come from outside observers. But the broad pattern is clear. Trade supports political power. Political power can protect and regulate trade. The two grow around one another. A merchant entering a controlled market may dislike paying a charge. He may also appreciate the fact that a stable authority can make commerce more predictable. Security has value, so does order. A market where merchants expect their goods to be stolen does not remain prosperous for long. Rulers therefore face an old balance. Take enough from commerce to benefit. Do not take so much that commerce chooses another route. This calculation will appear again when European rulers tax salt. Governments enjoy reliable revenue. Merchants enjoy avoiding it. Between them lies an endless historical argument. For now, the West African merchant looks at the salt. It has arrived from the north after an expensive journey. Farther south, salt can be harder to obtain. People and livestock need it. Preservation and food preparation create additional demand. In hot climates, the biological importance of salt is not difficult to understand. Human bodies lose salt through sweat. Animals also require access to salt. A supply that seems ordinary beside a desert mine becomes far more desirable when the mine is distant. Gold behaves differently. Important gold-producing regions lie to the south of the Great Desert Trade. Gold enters commercial networks from places where it can be obtained, and then moves toward markets where demand is strong. North African and Mediterranean merchants value it. Beyond them lie even larger networks connecting gold to the Islamic world, and eventually to European commerce. A piece of gold leaving West Africa may travel astonishingly far. It may pass through hands that know nothing of the mine or river from which it originally came. Again, the commodity hides its workers. Someone extracted it, someone washed earth, someone carried it, someone traded it. Eventually, a gold object may appear in a court thousands of miles away. The court remembers the gold, it forgets the hands. Salt does the same thing. The buyer sees a block. Not Tagaza, not the worker, not the camel, not the guide. The market is full of invisible biographies. This makes the meeting between salt and gold less like two treasures being placed on a scale and more like two enormous labor systems touching one another. Behind the salt stands the Sahara. Behind the gold stand landscapes farther south. Between them stand merchants. The price negotiated in the market is where those worlds meet. There are medieval accounts describing forms of trade in West Africa that later readers sometimes call silent trade. In these stories, merchants place goods at a location and withdraw. Other traders approach, leave an amount of gold, and withdraw in turn. The first group returns. If satisfied, they take the gold and leave the goods. If not, the process continues. The image is wonderfully mysterious. Two groups trading without speaking. Salt waiting alone beside gold. Like many memorable historical scenes, it deserves caution. Accounts were often written by people relying on reports about distant places. Descriptions can blend observation, hearsay, convention, and misunderstanding. Trade practices also vary across time and region. It is safer not to imagine all West African gold exchange operating through one strange silent ritual. Ordinary bargaining, intermediaries, established commercial relationships, and political regulation belong to the wider story too. History rarely organizes itself around the most cinematic version available. Still, the stories reveal something important. Gold-producing areas could be guarded carefully. Knowledge about the precise origins of gold had economic value. Merchants and rulers had reasons to control information. A source known to everyone is harder to monopolize. Secrecy becomes another kind of infrastructure. The same principle appears in many trades. A merchant protects a route. A craftsman protects a technique. A mining community protects knowledge of a deposit. Information can be as valuable as cargo. As centuries pass, political power in West Africa changes. The Ghana Empire declines. Other states rise. Eventually, Mali becomes one of the most famous powers in the region. Its wealth is closely associated with control over important territories and trade, including access to gold-producing areas. Then one ruler transforms that wealth into a story repeated for centuries. Mansa Musa. He rules Mali during the early 14th century. His pilgrimage to Mecca becomes legendary. The journey carries him across North Africa toward the Islamic holy cities. He travels with an impressive entourage, gold accompanies him, and the quantities described by later writers are extraordinary. The details vary across sources. Legends grow around wealthy rulers easily, but there is no serious doubt that Mansa Musa's pilgrimage displayed remarkable wealth and made Mali famous far beyond West Africa. In Cairo, accounts describe his generosity with gold as having noticeable economic effects. Later retellings sometimes make the consequences sound almost magical, as though one man casually broke an entire economy by handing out treasure. The reality should be approached more carefully, but the underlying image remains powerful. A ruler from West Africa arrives in major cities of the Islamic world with enough gold to make people remember him. This is the other half of the Salt story. The regions connected to the southern side of the Sahara are not merely desperate customers waiting for northern merchants to bring a precious necessity. They are part of wealthy and sophisticated political and commercial systems. Gold moves outward, scholars move, books move, merchants move, ideas move. Mali is not valuable because outsiders bring salt to it. The exchange works because different regions possess different advantages. Salt in the north, gold-producing zones farther south, agricultural products in other areas, commercial cities positioned between them. Value emerges from difference. Mansa Musa's fame also helps draw attention towards cities connected with Mali. Among the most famous is Timbuktu. The name later becomes almost mythical in European imagination. For some distant Europeans, Timbuktu comes to mean the end of the earth. A mysterious city of unimaginable wealth hidden somewhere beyond the desert. The real Timbuktu is more interesting than the fantasy. Its location near the Niger River and connections to trans-Saharan routes help make it an important center of commerce and scholarship. Salt can pass through its markets, so can gold, but books become important too. This surprises people who imagine trade only as physical necessities moving between primitive markets. Scholarship is also an economy. Teachers need support, students need texts, manuscripts must be copied, paper has value. Knowledge can be bought, sold, taught, inherited, and preserved. A city connected to long-distance trade can become a meeting point for ideas as well as goods. Imagine arriving at Timbuktu after weeks of desert travel. The first emotion may not be wonder, it may be relief. There are people, water, buildings, markets, information. The caravan can finally become something other than a moving survival problem. Loads are removed, animals rest. Merchants begin the work they crossed the desert to perform. Salt appears in the market. Its journey has made it expensive. A buyer may know that another caravan will eventually arrive, but eventually is not the same as today. Supply now matters. This is the difference between theoretical abundance and practical availability. There may be mountains of salt in the desert. If those mountains are weeks away, the household cannot use them tonight. A commodity is economically useful only when it can be reached. Transport turns geological abundance into market supply. The same is true of gold. A rich deposit beneath inaccessible ground is not yet wealth. Someone must extract it. Someone must secure it. Someone must move it. Someone must find a buyer. Value requires a chain. Break the chain and the treasure remains where it began. This is why the caravan matters as much as the mine. The salt merchant has transformed a desert deposit into something a distant buyer can actually use. His profit comes from that transformation. The gold merchant does the same in the opposite direction. Then the famous comparison appears again. Could salt really be worth more than gold? Under particular conditions, a highly necessary commodity transported into a place of scarcity can command extraordinary value. Historical writers describe salt as extremely valuable in parts of West Africa, and comparisons with gold appear in accounts and later retellings. But the claim should never be converted into a universal rule. There was no permanent law stating that 1 pound of salt always exceeded 1 pound of gold. Prices moved, locations differed, quality mattered, supply mattered. Political stability mattered. The arrival of a caravan mattered. A single statement cannot capture centuries of trade across an enormous region. The better lesson is simpler. Gold is not automatically the most valuable thing in every circumstance. Neither is salt. Value depends on what people have and what they lack. A person with abundant gold and no salt faces one calculation. A person beside a salt mine who has never seen gold faces another. Trade allows both to act on those differences. That is why the salt and gold story has survived. Beneath the exaggeration is a truth about human value. We desire what is difficult to obtain. We pay for distance. We pay for risk. We pay for scarcity. And when something is necessary, scarcity becomes especially powerful. The sun lowers over the market. The heat softens. A salt merchant counts what remains. Perhaps most of his load has been sold. Perhaps some will continue farther south. Another trader handles gold. The gold occupies far less space. It is almost insulting. Weeks of camel labor brought heavy blocks across the desert. Now, a small quantity of yellow metal can represent a large part of the value carried back north. But the merchant cannot eat gold. He cannot feed it to a camel. He cannot drink it. He cannot preserve meat with it. Its power depends on society agreeing to desire and exchange it. Salt begins from a different foundation. The human body needs sodium. Animals need salt. Food systems use it. Its economic importance can be shaped by culture and politics, but beneath those layers sits biology. This gives salt a kind of stubborn demand. A ruler can ban a luxury. Fashion can change. A jewel can become unfashionable. People still need salt. Governments notice this. The rulers and officials who benefit from trans-Saharan commerce already understand that goods moving through controlled territory can generate revenue. Elsewhere, other governments reach the same conclusion independently. Salt is especially tempting. Tax something people can easily avoid, and revenue may disappear. Tax something people need, and the payment can be more dependable. This logic will eventually create systems far more intrusive than a simple market toll. But before reaching royal tax offices, it is worth remembering the people who make the commodity itself. The worker cutting salt in the desert, the laborer tending a salt pan beside the sea, the person boiling brine over a smoky fire, the miner underground. A valuable commodity can enrich merchants and rulers while leaving the producer with very little. This contradiction is ancient. The person closest to wealth does not always control it. The gold miner may not own the gold. The salt worker may not control the salt. The caravan driver may not own the cargo. The political authority may touch none of these things and still collect revenue from all of them. Value travels upward through systems. Labor often remains where it began. Night settles over Timbuktu. A manuscript is closed somewhere in the city. A merchant finishes an account. Animals rest after a long journey. A block of salt waits in a storeroom. Gold waits somewhere else. Neither substance knows that future generations will compare them. They have no natural rivalry. Gold does not resent salt. Salt does not dream of becoming gold. Human beings create the comparison because comparisons make stories easier to remember, but the deeper story is not about which commodity wins. It is about why either one becomes valuable. Geology creates uneven supply. Human need creates demand. Distance creates cost. Labor creates access. Political power creates taxes. Trade connects everything. Tomorrow, another caravan will leave. Some goods will move north, others south. The desert will remain difficult. The market will remain hungry. And somewhere far from Timbuktu, another worker will begin producing the white mineral that keeps the system moving. To find that worker, we must leave the gold behind. We must return to salt itself, to shallow pans under a blinding sun, to brine steaming above fires, to mines where daylight disappears. The great trade networks have shown us what salt can be worth. Now it is time to see what that value costs the people who actually make it. Let us leave the gold behind, leave the merchants counting profit, leave the caravans resting after the long desert road. Leave the rulers watching goods move through their territories. The story now returns to the people standing closest to the salt itself. Morning begins beside shallow water. The horizon is flat. A pale sky reflects across a series of carefully managed ponds separated by narrow banks of earth. Farther away lies the sea. There are no dark tunnels here, no camel bells, no crowded market. Only water, wind, sunlight, mud, and people waiting for nature to perform part of the work. This is a salt-making landscape. The principle seems almost absurdly simple. Seawater contains salt. Remove enough water and the salt remains. But simple principles can require difficult labor. The sea does not politely deliver dry crystals into baskets. Water has to be guided. Channels must be maintained. Banks must be repaired. Ponds must be managed. The weather must cooperate. A worker walks carefully along the edge of a shallow pan. His feet know the ground. A newcomer would watch every step. He does not. Years of repetition have taught his body where to place its weight. He looks across the water. To an inexperienced visitor, one pond may resemble another. To the worker, small differences matter. The color, the surface, the depth, the condition of the brine, the weather, the direction of the wind. Experience becomes a measuring instrument. No glowing screen gives him a perfect reading. His eyes do much of the work. Sun and wind gradually remove water. The brine becomes more concentrated. Eventually, crystals begin forming. Then human labor becomes more visible. Tools move across the pan. Salt is gathered. Wet crystals are drawn together into pale piles. A worker pushes, pulls, lifts, carries, then repeats the process. Salt production is full of repetition. This makes it easy for later history to ignore. A battle can be described as one dramatic afternoon. A coronation has a date. A ruler dies once. Salt has to be gathered again tomorrow. Necessary labor rarely provides a convenient climax, it simply continues. By mid-morning, sunlight reflects from water and pale salt. The brightness can become exhausting. There may be little shade, skin feels dry, clothing gathers sweat. The worker is surrounded by the same mineral his own body requires. Salt leaves him while he produces salt. There's a quiet irony in that. The work depends heavily on weather. A good period of sun and wind helps evaporation. Rain does the opposite. A sudden change can interfere with production. Salt is remarkably useful because of its relationship with water, but that relationship makes storage difficult too. The worker spends days helping water leave the brine. Afterward, everyone must prevent water from returning. A pile left exposed to rain can suffer. A damp storehouse creates problems. Salt must be protected. The entire business is an argument with moisture. Remove it here, keep it away there, watch the sky, move the pile, cover the load, then hope the weather behaves. The merchant who eventually buys the salt may see only quantity and price. He does not see the morning when rain ruined work. He does not see the bank that had to be repaired. He does not see the worker's shoulders. Commodities hide labor. We have seen this before. The gold object hides the miner. The barrel of fish hides the fisherman and cooper. The loaf hides the field. The salt pile hides the person standing ankle-deep beside shallow water. This disappearance becomes stronger as the commodity travels. By the time salt reaches a distant kitchen, the worker has vanished completely. But the cost of his labor remains somewhere inside the price. Now move to another salt-producing region. The climate is less cooperative. Sunlight alone cannot always be trusted to remove enough water efficiently. Here, brine can be heated. The scene changes. Open brightness becomes smoke. A fire burns beneath a vessel holding salty water. Steam rises. The room or working area is hot and damp. Wood waits nearby. The principle is again simple. Heat the brine, water evaporates. Salt remains. But every flame has a history. Someone cut the wood, someone split it, someone carried it, someone stacked it, someone feeds it into the fire. Producing salt by boiling brine can require large quantities of fuel. This means a salt works does not depend only on the brine source. It also reaches into the surrounding landscape for energy. Trees become heat, heat removes water, water leaves salt. A forest becomes part of a white crystal without ever touching it. The worker tending the fire understands this relationship practically. Too little fuel and production slows. Poorly managed heat wastes time. Equipment must be maintained. Brine must be supplied. Finished salt must be removed and dried. Nothing about the process is effortless. Steam fills the air, smoke clings to clothing. The worker's face becomes hot. His hands repeat movements learned through years of practice. Listen to the fire. Watch the brine. Add fuel, wait, check, move, repeat. Skill often looks boring from the outside because an experienced person prevents mistakes before they become visible. A visitor sees someone standing beside a boiling pan. The worker sees dozens of small decisions. This is true of many old trades. A blacksmith hears the metal, a sailor feels the wind, a farmer reads the sky, a salt worker recognizes changes in brine. Knowledge settles into the body. A child may begin by carrying something small, then watching, then helping. Years later, the child has become the worker who no longer needs to think consciously about every movement. The knowledge survives without a manual. Production continues. Some salt comes from seawater, some from natural brines, some from rock deposits underground. Different landscapes create different techniques. At a mine, the problem is extraction. At a salt pan, evaporation. At a brine works fuel. But all three systems require labor. The white crystal that eventually appears on a table is the final result of very different human experiences. One worker spends the day beneath the earth, another beneath harsh sunlight, another beside a hot fire. The customer sees the same salt. This is one reason commodities can make societies feel simpler than they really are. The finished product erases the method. A handful of salt does not tell you whether someone mined it, evaporated seawater, or boiled brine. It does not tell you whether the worker was free, poor, well-paid, indebted, coerced, independent, or controlled by an owner. It does not tell you how far the salt traveled. It does not tell you who collected tax. The crystal carries no label explaining its social history, yet that social history determines who benefits. A valuable commodity does not automatically make its producer wealthy. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in economic history. A region can produce something valuable while the workers remain poor. The reason is simple. Producing value and controlling value are not the same thing. The salt worker may receive wages, a landowner may control the site, a merchant may control access to distant markets, a political authority may collect taxes. Someone else may own transport. Each person occupies a different position in the chain. The person doing the hardest physical work may have the least power over the final price. Imagine the worker beside the salt pan at the end of the day. Piles of crystals wait nearby. A visitor might describe them as wealth. The worker sees tomorrow's labor. He cannot simply fill a cart and sell the salt wherever he wishes. Perhaps the land belongs to someone else. Perhaps production is controlled. Perhaps a merchant has already agreed on the price. Perhaps authorities regulate the trade. The salt is physically close and economically distant. This pattern appears with gold too. A miner can stand beside precious metal and remain poor. A sailor can carry luxury cargo and own none of it. A servant can spend the day inside a palace and possess almost nothing. Proximity to wealth is not ownership. The merchant arrives, he examines the salt. Quality matters, moisture matters, quantity matters. He may complain. Merchants have been complaining about quality for as long as producers have been complaining about merchants. The producer knows how much work stands in front of him. The buyer knows another seller may exist elsewhere. They negotiate. Again, the price becomes a conversation between different kinds of knowledge. The worker remembers labor. The merchant remembers markets. If an agreement is reached, salt begins moving. It enters sacks, baskets, barrels, or other containers depending on place and period. Then transportation starts. The producer's part of the journey becomes invisible. A cart carries the load away. Perhaps it reaches a river, perhaps a ship, perhaps another market, perhaps another merchant. Every transfer adds another person who needs payment. This helps explain why a commodity can be cheap near production and expensive at the destination. The final buyer is paying for an entire chain: production, storage, transport, risk, loss, market fees, taxes, profit. The salt itself may be the simplest part. Governments notice this chain. They notice something else too. Salt has dependable demand. This is an attractive quality if one is searching for revenue. A ruler deciding what to tax faces a problem. Tax a luxury too heavily, and people may stop buying it. Tax trade too heavily, and merchants may choose another route. Tax something difficult to monitor, and much of the revenue disappears before reaching the treasury. Salt offers possibilities. People need it. Production often occurs in identifiable places. Mines can be controlled. Salt pans can be watched. Brine sources can be regulated. Major trade routes can be inspected. Markets can be licensed. The commodity is heavy enough that large quantities are inconvenient to hide. From the ruler's perspective, this begins to look promising. From the worker's perspective, it looks like another person standing between labor and payment. The first regulation may appear modest, a fee, a required market, a rule about who can sell, then systems grow, administrators are hired, records are created. Official warehouses appear. Prices may be controlled. Monopolies can develop. The government may decide that salt is too useful as a source of revenue to leave entirely to ordinary trade. Once that happens, a crystal produced by sun and water becomes political. The worker beside the pan does not need to understand state finance. He understands the result. Perhaps he must sell to an approved buyer. Perhaps production is counted. Perhaps an official appears. Perhaps rules determine where salt can go. The state enters the workplace. This transformation can happen gradually enough that no single day feels revolutionary. A new regulation arrives. People complain, then adapt. Another rule follows. Another payment, another inspection. Years later, the system feels permanent. This is how bureaucracy often grows, not as one enormous invention, as layers. The layers matter because they change the price paid by the household at the end. The worker produces salt, the merchant transports it, the official collects revenue, the customer pays for all three. A wealthy customer may barely notice, a poor customer does. This is the dangerous side of taxing necessities. Everyone needs salt, but not everyone has the same amount of money. A rich household does not need 100 times more salt simply because it possesses 100 times more wealth. So a charge on salt can consume a larger share of a poor household's resources. Governments may see stable revenue, families may see food becoming more expensive. Both are looking at the same system from opposite ends. The worker continues gathering salt. The ruler never touches the pan, yet the ruler may earn more from the commodity than the worker does. Power has learned how to profit from distance. By evening, the salt pans turn gold beneath the lowering sun. For a moment, the scene is beautiful enough to hide the labor. The water reflects the sky. Pale piles rise along the edge. A worker's shadow stretches across the ground. He is tired. Tomorrow he will return. At the brine works, another worker feeds the last wood into a fire. Steam continues rising. At a mine, someone walks toward daylight. 3 different landscapes. 3 different methods. One commodity. The people producing it may never meet. They are connected by the fact that other people need what they make, and that need is about to become extremely useful to rulers. Somewhere far from the salt pan, an official sits beside a ledger. He does not see sunlight reflecting on brine. He sees numbers. How much salt was produced? How much was sold? How much moved through the market? How much revenue could be collected? The questions sound dull. Their consequences will not be. In France, salt taxation will eventually become associated with one of the most hated fiscal systems of the old monarchy. Different regions will pay under different rules. Smuggling will become profitable. Officials will pursue people carrying illegal salt. Ordinary households will find political authority sitting beside the cooking fire in the form of a higher price. The salt worker has spent all day removing water. The government is about to add something much harder to remove: tax. Now we leave the salt worker beside the shallow pan and follow the crystals into a room where nobody is wet. Nobody is carrying heavy baskets, and nobody is standing beneath the sun. There is a desk, there is ink, there is paper, and there is an official. The room is quiet. A ledger lies open. Lines of writing record quantities, payments, places, and names. To the salt worker, salt is labor. To the merchant, salt is cargo. To the household, salt is necessity. To the officials, salt is becoming something else. Revenue. This transformation does not belong to one country or one century. Across history, governments repeatedly discover that salt has several qualities that make it attractive for taxation. People need it. They purchase it repeatedly. Large-scale production often occurs at identifiable locations. Salt moves through trade routes that can sometimes be watched. It is bulky enough that transporting large quantities secretly can be difficult. And demand does not disappear simply because the government raises the price. For a ruler trying to pay soldiers, maintain a court, build fortifications, finance administration, or fight another ruler who is attempting exactly the same things, these qualities are extremely interesting. The ruler does not need to love salt. He needs money. A tax collector looks at a salt warehouse and sees a dependable stream of it. The idea seems simple. Charge something on the salt, collect the money, continue ruling. But taxes rarely remain as simple in the household as they appear in the ledger. Travel now to France. The exact year matters less than the long system developing across centuries. Salt taxation becomes associated with a word that will acquire an unpleasant reputation: the gabelle. The term can refer to taxes more broadly in earlier contexts, but it becomes especially associated with the French salt tax. Over time, the system becomes complicated. Very complicated. This is one of the great talents of government. It can take a white crystal and surround it with paperwork. Different regions of France do not necessarily live under identical rules. Some areas face heavier obligations. Others enjoy different arrangements because of historical privileges, political agreements, or local conditions. There are regions where salt is taxed under one system and neighboring areas where the burden is different. This creates a problem that any merchant can understand immediately. If the same commodity has two very different legal prices on opposite sides of a boundary, someone will try to move it across that boundary. The government calls this smuggling. The smuggler calls it business. Imagine a village household. There is no grand political meeting around the table. No one is discussing theories of taxation. The family needs salt. Meat may need preserving. Food needs preparing. Animals may require it. The household would like to obtain enough without surrendering too much of its limited money. But under some forms of the French system, people can face obligations concerning where salt is purchased and how much must be bought. Official salt is sold through controlled channels. The price contains the tax. This means the state has entered the kitchen without physically entering the house. A family reaches for salt, part of the price reaches the government. The arrangement is efficient from the perspective of revenue. From the perspective of a poor household, it can feel deeply unfair. A rich man and a poor man both need salt. The rich man may consume more in an absolute sense, especially in a large household, but his income is far greater. The tax, therefore, bites differently. A few additional coins mean little to someone with plenty. To a laborer, they may represent bread, fuel, clothing repair. Another necessity delayed. Taxes are experienced not as percentages, but as things a household can no longer buy. This is why a levy that looks modest in a government account can generate anger far beyond its numerical size. The burden is also made worse by inequality between regions. Imagine living near a boundary. On your side, legal salt is expensive. A few miles away, it is cheaper. The landscape has not changed. The human body has not changed. The salt itself has not changed. Only the law changes. This is almost an invitation. Night falls. A man prepares to travel. He is not a glamorous criminal. There is no black cape, no secret castle. Perhaps he is a farmer, perhaps a laborer. Perhaps someone who has discovered that moving salt illegally pays better than the work available to him. He knows the paths. He knows where officials may watch. He knows which neighbor can be trusted. Somewhere beyond the boundary is cheaper salt. If he can bring it into the high-tax region and sell it below the official price, customers will appear. The government has created the profit margin. The smuggler merely walks through it. This is one of the recurring ironies of taxation. A large price difference can make illegal trade worth the risk. The greater the difference, the more people may become willing to participate. Then the government needs enforcement. Officials are hired. Patrols increase. Searches occur. Penalties become necessary. Courts become involved. prisons receive offenders. The original tax was supposed to produce revenue. Now part of that revenue must support the system protecting the tax. Bureaucracy feeds on resistance. Resistance feeds on bureaucracy, and Salt sits quietly in the middle. The smuggler moves after dark. His load is much less impressive than a caravan crossing the Sahara. Yet the logic is similar. He is moving salt from a place where it is cheaper to a place where it is more expensive. The difference is that geography no longer creates most of the price gap. Government policy does. Political boundaries have become artificial mountains. Cross them successfully and value rises. The smuggler listens. A dog barking in the distance may mean nothing. A light on the road may mean trouble. He avoids the obvious route. Salt is heavy, which makes the work irritating. A person carrying illegal silk can conceal significant value in a small package. Salt does not cooperate. A profitable quantity takes space. Transport becomes difficult. The same physical property that made salt expensive across the Sahara now makes smuggling more dangerous in France. The commodity refuses to become convenient merely because the law has changed. Perhaps the smuggler reaches a house. The customer is waiting. No one needs a speech. The transaction is simple. The illegal salt costs less than the official salt. The buyer saves money. The seller earns money. The state receives nothing. From the household's perspective, the arrangement may feel reasonable. From the government's perspective, it is an attack on revenue. This difference in perspective explains the severity with which smuggling can be treated. To modern eyes, harsh punishment over salt can seem absurd, but the authorities are not protecting seasoning. They are protecting a fiscal system. If illegal salt spreads widely, the official monopoly weakens. If the monopoly weakens, revenue falls. If enforcement appears weak, more people may take the risk. The state therefore has an incentive to make examples. Smugglers associated with the illegal salt trade become known in France as faux saunières. The term belongs to a world in which moving an ordinary mineral can turn a villager into a serious offender. Enforcement can include fines, imprisonment, and other severe penalties depending on period and circumstance. The details of the Gebel change across time and region, so there is no single experience shared by every French household. That complexity is important. It is easy to describe the Gebel as though one king invented one tax on one morning and every French person immediately paid the same amount. The historical reality is much messier. Privileges accumulate, exemptions survive, regional systems differ. Administrative categories multiply. Old arrangements sit beside newer ones. This makes the tax more frustrating, not less. People compare themselves with neighbors. Humans are often willing to tolerate a burden more easily when everyone seems to carry it. Unequal burdens create another kind of anger. Why does that town pay less? Why does that region have privileges? Why must this household buy official salt under rules that do not apply elsewhere? The complaint is no longer only about price, it becomes about fairness. Governments can survive expensive systems. They have more difficulty when expensive systems are also widely believed to be unjust. The ledger on the official's desk cannot easily measure resentment. It records revenue, confiscations, perhaps arrests. It does not record the conversation beside the village hearth. A father complains. A neighbor repeats a story about an inspector. Someone knows a man punished for illegal salt. Someone else has relatives living in a region with different rules. Every story becomes part of the tax. The emotional cost spreads through memory. This is how an administrative system becomes a symbol. Salt itself may represent only a small part of everything people dislike about government, but it is encountered repeatedly that matters. A tax on an event that happens once in a lifetime can be hated once. A tax attached to a necessity returns to the household again and again. Every purchase reminds the buyer. Every inspection reminds the merchant. Every arrest reminds the village. Repetition turns irritation into culture. The French monarchy has many sources of revenue and many financial problems. War is expensive, courts are expensive, administration is expensive. Debt becomes a persistent concern. No single tax explains the enormous political crisis that eventually brings down the old regime. The French Revolution does not occur simply because people dislike paying for salt. That would be another wonderfully neat historical myth. The causes are far broader: fiscal crisis, social inequality, political conflict, harvest problems, food prices, Enlightenment ideas, institutional struggles, questions of privilege and representation. The Gabelle belongs inside this larger world. It matters because it becomes one visible example of unequal and burdensome taxation. Salt is small enough to sit on a table and large enough to symbolize a system. By the late 18th century, dissatisfaction with old fiscal arrangements exists alongside much deeper political tensions. When revolution begins, institutions associated with privilege and unpopular taxation become targets for reform and abolition. The gabelle is abolished during the revolutionary transformation. For the household, this means an old political relationship with salt has been broken, but governments have long memories when revenue is involved. Salt taxation in France does not disappear forever, with one revolutionary decision. Forms of salt taxation return later. The lesson is familiar. A useful source of money is difficult for states to forget. Elsewhere, rulers reach similar conclusions. Salt monopolies and taxes appear in different forms across countries and centuries. China offers one of the longest and most important examples. Chinese states use salt revenue in various ways across long periods of history. Because salt is necessary and production can be regulated, control over its trade becomes a significant fiscal tool. Systems change from dynasty to dynasty. Licenses, merchants, production areas, and government administration interact in complicated ways. Again, the principle is simple even when the bureaucracy is not. People need salt. The state controls part of the system. Revenue follows. But control creates incentives for evasion. Official salt has competition from unofficial salt. Smuggling appears. Corruption appears. Officials and merchants develop relationships. Rules intended to create order generate new opportunities for people skilled at avoiding rules. The same pattern repeats because human incentives repeat, raise the legal price enough, and illegal supply becomes attractive. Make licensing valuable and people compete for licenses. Give officials power and some officials will sell favors. Create a monopoly and someone will attempt to break it. Salt reveals the state not as an abstract idea, but as a daily experience. A government is not only a king on a throne, it is the person inspecting a load, the document required to sell. The warehouse where official salt must be purchased. The boundary where a traveler is stopped. The price a family pays. This is what political power feels like from below. It feels administrative. Often boring, sometimes irritating, occasionally frightening. The salt tax also teaches rulers something dangerous. Necessity makes people dependable customers, but dependable customers are not infinitely obedient. There is a limit. The limit differs from place to place. People may tolerate high prices for years. They may adapt, buy less, use salt more carefully, smuggle, bribe, complain, move goods through family networks. Every act becomes a response to the system. A tax changes behavior. The official ledger records only part of that behavior. Return to the French countryside. Morning arrives. The smuggler who traveled during the night has survived another journey. Perhaps he earned enough to justify the risk. Perhaps he decides to go again. Success creates repetition. Repetition creates routes. Soon, officials learn the routes too. The contest becomes almost ecological. Smugglers adapt to patrols. Patrols adapt to smugglers. New paths appear. Informants appear. False loads appear. People learn schedules. The state becomes another landscape to navigate. A hill can be crossed. A river can be forded. An inspector can perhaps be avoided. Geography and government begin to resemble one another. Both create obstacles. Both create routes. Both add cost. This is a strange transformation for salt. At Hallstatt, geology determined where it could be found. Across the Sahara, distance determined much of its value. In medieval Europe, winter made preservation urgent. Now law creates scarcity of another kind. There may be plenty of physical salt available, but only certain salt is legal. The government has divided identical crystals into two categories: permitted, forbidden. The salt does not know the difference. A crystal carried by an official merchant and a crystal carried by a smuggler can be chemically identical. One produces revenue, the other produces a crime. Human institutions have added meaning that nature never provided. This is one of the deepest themes in the history of commodities. Objects are physical, Value is social. Gold becomes money because people agree it can represent wealth. Paper becomes currency because institutions support it. A boundary turns ordinary cargo into contraband. A stamp turns one package into legal merchandise. A tax turns necessity into revenue. The object remains unchanged. The world around it changes. By evening, an official closes his ledger. Perhaps the numbers look satisfactory. Revenue has been collected, a confiscation has been recorded, the system appears orderly on paper. Far away, a poor household measures salt carefully. A merchant calculates whether another illegal journey is worth the danger. A worker at a salt pan prepares for tomorrow. None of them experiences the system as a neat column of figures. History often survives in documents written by the people who counted. But daily life was lived by the people being counted. That difference is worth carrying with us, because our next journey follows salt into an even larger imperial system. We leave the French boundary road, we cross seas, we move toward the Indian subcontinent there. British colonial rule will eventually place salt inside a structure of taxation and monopoly that reaches millions of people. And centuries after the anonymous French smuggler slips along a dark road to avoid an inspector, another man will challenge a salt law in a completely different way. He will not hide, he will announce where he is going. He will walk for days, people will join him, reporters will watch, officials will wait, and when he reaches the sea, he will bend down and lift salt into his hand. The crystal will be ordinary. The act will not be. Let us leave the dark smuggling paths of France behind and travel much farther east. The road changes again. The landscape grows warmer. The language changes. The architecture changes. The political system changes. But salt remains exactly what it has always been. Ordinary, necessary, easy to overlook until someone controls it. We arrive in British-ruled India during the early 20th century. For generations, British colonial authorities have treated salt as a source of revenue. The details of taxation and administration have changed over time, but the central problem is familiar. People need salt. The government controls important parts of its production and sale. Taxes increase the price. The burden reaches households regardless of whether those households possess much money. A wealthy person can pay more easily, a poor laborer cannot. Yet both bodies need salt. This is what makes the commodity politically useful and politically dangerous. A tax on a luxury can sometimes be avoided by refusing the luxury. A tax on salt follows people into the kitchen. It appears beside rice, beside vegetables, beside preserved food, beside the meal of a worker who may have no interest in political theory. The government does not need to enter his house. Its authority is already sitting on the plate. By the late 1920s, the Indian independence movement has developed through decades of political organization, debate, protest, repression, reform, and resistance. There is no single voice and no single strategy. India is enormous. Its population contains different languages, religions, regions, classes, political organizations, and visions of the future. British rule cannot be reduced to one law. Resistance to it cannot be reduced to one man. But one man understands the symbolic power of ordinary things unusually well, Mohandas Gandhi. By this point, Gandhi is already internationally known. He has developed methods of non-violent resistance through earlier political struggles. He speaks about self-rule, economic independence, discipline, and resistance to unjust authority. He also understands that political movements need symbols people can touch. Salt provides one. At first, choosing salt as the focus of a major campaign does not impress everyone. There are larger constitutional questions, there are land taxes, there is poverty, there are labor disputes, there is political representation. There are countless grievances associated with colonial rule. Why salt? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. Everyone understands salt. A complicated constitutional argument may require explanation. A poor villager does not need a lecture to understand why being restricted from freely producing or collecting a necessary substance can feel unjust. Salt crosses class, it crosses region, it crosses many social boundaries. The rich use it, the poor use it, Hindus use it, Muslims use it, people in cities use it, people in villages use it. The commodity creates a language that does not require advanced education. This is the political power of the ordinary. Gandhi chooses to challenge the salt laws. He does not plan to sneak past an inspector at night. He does almost the opposite. He announces resistance publicly. The journey will begin at Sabarmati Ashram near Ahmedabad. The destination will be the coastal village of Dandi. The distance is roughly 240 miles. The march begins in March of 1930. Gandhi leaves with a small group of selected followers. There are fewer than 100 at the beginning. The number is not the point. The road is. They walk. This matters. A political protest could be expressed in a speech, a petition, a meeting, a newspaper article. A march transforms an idea into movement. Every mile creates another opportunity for people to watch. Another village, another conversation. Another night, another report. The protest becomes a story before it reaches the sea. Morning begins early. The marchers prepare. Gandhi is already an older man. He walks with a staff. The pace must be sustainable because the journey will take weeks. Dust rises beneath feet. Villagers gather along the route. Some come out from curiosity, some from sympathy. Some want to see Gandhi. Others want to hear what the march means. The explanation returns to salt, a necessary commodity, a colonial law, a deliberate act of disobedience waiting at the coast. The simplicity is powerful. The march is not yet breaking the salt law in the final symbolic sense. It is approaching the place where that will happen. This creates anticipation. Every day becomes part of the protest. British officials face an uncomfortable problem. They know what Gandhi is doing. There is no secret. Arresting him immediately may create sympathy and attention. Ignoring him allows the march to grow. The colonial government has far greater physical power than the people walking along the road. But political power is not only the ability to arrest, it is also the ability to make authority appear legitimate. This is where salt becomes dangerous. The law may be enforceable, but can it be made to look reasonable? Imagine explaining the situation in the simplest possible terms. A man walks to the sea. He intends to collect salt. The government may arrest him for it. The more ordinary the act appears, the more extraordinary the law can seem. Gandhi understands this contrast. The march continues. Day after day, the road becomes a kind of moving classroom. Gandhi speaks in villages. He discusses salt, but also broader questions of self-rule and social discipline. The campaign is carefully framed around non-violent civil disobedience. Participants are expected to accept punishment without violent retaliation. This is not passivity. It is a strategy designed to expose the force required to maintain a law. If the state arrests peaceful people for making salt, the arrest itself becomes part of the political message. The British Empire is accustomed to governing through institutions: police, officials, courts, taxation, military force, and administrative routines. Gandhi is attempting to turn those routines into theatre without making the protest theatrical in a trivial sense. An official enforces the law. A protester refuses to obey. The protester accepts the consequence. Observers judge the encounter. The audience matters. Indian newspapers matter. Foreign journalists matter. International opinion matters. The empire is no longer operating in a world where an unpopular local tax can remain invisible outside the region. News travels quickly. Photographs travel. Reports travel. The Salt March becomes both a physical journey and a media event. Yet for the people walking, the road remains physical. Feet hurt. Heat matters. Dust settles on clothing. Meals must be prepared. Bodies need rest. A symbolic march still requires ordinary logistics. Someone needs water. Someone needs food. Someone must arrange places to sleep. The same rule that followed Roman armies and Saharan caravans follows political protest. Every great movement contains a supply problem. The marchers continue south toward the Arabian Sea. Crowds grow. Not everyone joins the full journey. Many gather temporarily. Some listen, some offer support. The image of Gandhi walking becomes increasingly powerful. The destination approaches, Dandi, the sea. For thousands of years, humans have obtained salt from seawater. Sun, wind, brine, evaporation, crystals. The process is older than the British Empire and will outlive it. This is precisely why the law can appear so strange. The sea contains salt. Nature places it there. The state claims authority over how people may obtain and sell it. Colonial administration has turned a natural substance into regulated revenue. Gandhi intends to challenge that claim with his hand. Early April arrives. The march has lasted more than 3 weeks. The travelers reach Dandi. The journey that began inland now meets the coast. The Arabian Sea stretches before them. There is no fortress to capture, no palace, no treasury. No battlefield, only shore. Morning comes. Gandhi approaches the beach. The act that follows is deliberately small. He picks up salty material from the shore, often described in retellings as a lump of salt or salt-bearing mud. By doing so, he breaks the colonial salt law. That is all. No building falls, no official surrenders. The British Empire still governs India when the sun sets. Yet the meaning of the act is much larger than its physical size. A handful of salt has become a declaration. The government says this substance belongs inside a regulated system. Gandhi says the law is unjust and should be disobeyed. Once the act occurs, others can repeat it. That is the real danger to authority. A symbol becomes powerful when imitation is easy. Most people cannot seize a government building. They cannot negotiate with a viceroy. They cannot command an army. But many people can make, collect, buy, or sell illegal salt. Civil disobedience spreads. People begin violating the salt laws in different places. Salt is produced illegally. Demonstrations occur. Other forms of protest expand. The colonial authorities respond with arrests. Thousands of people are detained during the wider campaign. Gandhi himself is eventually arrested, but arrest does not erase the symbol. In some ways, it strengthens it. The government now faces the problem built into the campaign from the beginning. Enforcement can make the law look harsher. One confrontation becomes particularly famous. After Gandhi's arrest, plans continue for protest against the Dharasana salt works. Volunteers approach in disciplined groups. Police respond violently. The American journalist Webb Miller reports on the beatings of nonviolent protesters. His descriptions travel internationally. The details are disturbing precisely because the protesters are not attacking in return. The salt works becomes more than a production site. It becomes a stage on which the relationship between imperial authority and nonviolent resistance is visible to distant audiences. This is a remarkable transformation. Remember the salt worker from our previous journey. A shallow pan, sunlight, brine, crystals, ordinary labor. Now a salt works can become a political symbol watched around the world. The salt itself has not changed. The surrounding institutions have. This pattern has followed us throughout the story. At Hallstatt, geology creates value. Across the Sahara, distance creates value. In France, law creates an illegal price difference. In India, colonial control turns salt into a symbol of political authority. The object remains stubbornly ordinary. Humans keep changing what it means. The Salt March does not immediately end British rule. This is important. History becomes misleading when one dramatic event is allowed to swallow everything around it. Indian independence comes much later, after continued political struggle, repression, negotiation, global war, changing British power, mass movements, competing political organizations, communal tensions, and countless individual actions. The Salt March is not a magical moment in which the empire simply realizes it has lost. Its importance lies elsewhere. It demonstrates the reach of civil disobedience. It mobilizes people. It attracts international attention. It challenges the moral legitimacy of a specific colonial law, while connecting that law to the broader question of British rule, and it gives independence a physical symbol. Salt, something anyone can understand. This is why Gandhi's choice is so effective. He takes the logic governments have used for centuries and reverses it. Governments tax salt because everyone needs it. Gandhi protests salt because everyone needs it. The same universality that makes the commodity attractive to the state makes it useful to resistance. The ruler sees dependable revenue. The protester sees a shared grievance. Both are correct. This is the political paradox of necessity. A government can profit from something everyone needs. But if people decide the control is unjust, everyone has a reason to care. Return for a moment to the coast at Dandi. The crowd eventually moves. The day continues. The tide changes. People eat. Someone probably complains about something ordinary. History does not feel historical every minute, even when it is happening. The salty material Gandhi lifted from the shore is physically insignificant. Most salt disappears when used. This handful becomes almost the opposite. It grows through memory, photographs, speeches, books, school lessons, political history. The commodity that normally vanishes into dinner becomes impossible to consume. It has become a symbol. There is another irony here. For most of our journey, salt's value has depended on scarcity. Far from a mine, it becomes expensive. Across a desert, transport raises the price. A monopoly can restrict legal supply, but Gandhi draws power from abundance. The sea is full of salt. The very fact that nature provides so much of it makes exclusive control easier to question. Why should an empire claim such authority over something lying along the shore? The political question is more complicated than that sentence. Tax systems always are, but symbols do not become powerful because they contain every detail. They become powerful because they make complicated systems emotionally visible. A handful of salt does that. Years pass. The independence movement continues. The world changes. Another global war transforms Britain and India. Political negotiations intensify. Violence and communal conflict create terrible suffering. Eventually, British colonial rule ends. India becomes independent. Partition creates India and Pakistan, accompanied by enormous displacement and bloodshed. The story cannot end with a simple triumphant march from Dandi to freedom. History rarely permits such clean endings, but the salt remains part of the memory. Not because it defeated an empire by itself, because it helped ordinary people see an empire in an ordinary object. This is one of the strangest achievements any commodity can have. Salt begins as geology, then food, then trade, then tax, then crime, then protest. A crystal moves through human institutions without changing its chemical identity. The meanings pile up around it. At Dandi, evening arrives over the Arabian Sea. The same water that carried merchants for centuries moves toward shore. Salt remains dissolved within it. No government can remove all of it. No protester can collect all of it. The supply is immense. The argument was never truly about the amount. It was about authority. Who may produce, who may sell, who may tax, who decides what is legal. Those questions follow commodities wherever states attempt to control them. And they will follow us into the next story. Because salt does not only preserve meat or challenge governments, it shapes cities, it creates fortunes, it determines where industries appear, it leaves its name on roads and settlements. Long before modern refrigeration makes it seem cheap and forgettable, entire communities grow around places where salt can be mined, boiled, traded, and taxed. So we leave Gandhi beside the sea, we leave the marchers and the colonial officials behind. The road bends again. This time, it leads toward towns built around brine, mines, warehouses, and trade. Places where salt is no longer merely an object inside history. It has become part of the landscape of human settlement itself. Let us leave the warm shore at Dandi behind and follow salt back into the landscape. Not into a kitchen, not into a tax office, not onto the back of a camel. This time, we will remain in one place long enough to watch buildings appear around it. A road, a warehouse, a workshop, a market, then houses, then more roads. A settlement grows. The reason is hidden beneath the ground. Salt has a peculiar ability to create towns. This does not happen everywhere. Salt is found. A deposit alone cannot guarantee prosperity. It must be accessible enough to exploit. There must be demand. Transport must be possible. Political conditions must allow trade to function. But when these pieces meet, salt can anchor human settlement for centuries. Return for a moment to Hallstatt. We began there in darkness, following a worker into an alpine mountain. Now look at the same place from a greater distance. The lake lies beneath steep slopes. The settlement seems squeezed between mountain and water. Modern visitors come partly because the landscape is beautiful. But the human relationship with this place is much older than tourism. Salt helped make Hallstatt important long before anyone arrived to admire the view. Mining creates a practical problem. Workers need somewhere to live. They need food, tools, timber, clothing, containers, animals, transport. A mine cannot function as an isolated hole in a mountain. People gather around it, some mine, others support the miners. A person who repairs tools may never cut salt himself, yet salt supports his work. A farmer selling food to miners participates in the salt economy without entering the mine. A carrier earns money because the mineral has to move. A merchant arrives because distant buyers exist. A settlement begins organizing itself around the needs of extraction. This is how a resource changes geography. The salt is underground. The consequences appear above it. Paths become busier. Storage becomes necessary. Exchange increases. People who might otherwise have little reason to visit the valley now come because something valuable can be obtained there. Salt pulls human movement toward itself. Then trade pushes movement outward again. This creates a rhythm. Goods enter. Salt leaves. People enter. Money or other goods return. The settlement becomes a hinge between geology and commerce. Hallstatt is not the only place whose identity becomes tied to salt. Across Europe, names themselves preserve memories of the commodity. The Germanic element associated with salt appears in various place names: Halle, Hallean, Hallstatt, Schwäbisch Hall. The linguistic histories of individual names can be complicated, and it is wise not to force every similar-sounding place into one simple explanation. But the broader connection between salt production and the identities of numerous European settlements is unmistakable. Language becomes a kind of archaeological layer. Even after an old industry changes, the name can remain. People may forget why their town was important. The word remembers. Travel now towards Salzburg. Today, the name evokes music, churches, mountains, and elegant streets. But the name itself means something close to Salt Fortress or Salt Castle. Salt from nearby areas contributes to the wealth and importance of the region. The commodity moves along river systems and trade routes. Authorities understand its value. Control over salt can support political power. Again, the crystal does not merely enter meals. It enters architecture. Money from trade helps support buildings. Institutions grow. Religious and political elites participate in the economy surrounding the commodity. A visitor centuries later may admire a church without thinking about salt. But wealth has a way of changing form. A commodity leaves a mine. It becomes revenue. Revenue pays laborers. Laborers raise stone. Stone becomes a building. The salt disappears. The architecture remains. This is one reason economic history can be difficult to see. We tend to notice the final object: a palace, a cathedral, a city wall. We do not always notice the ordinary goods whose taxation or trade helped finance it. Wealth changes costume. Salt becomes stone. Grain becomes armies. Wool becomes churches. Trade becomes streets. Follow another road toward Lüneburg in northern Germany. Here, brine beneath the ground supports a salt industry that becomes deeply important to the town. The method differs from the mine at Hallstatt. Brine can be brought up and boiled. Water must be removed. That means fuel. A great deal of fuel, wood becomes essential. The salt works therefore reaches beyond the town into surrounding forests. Trees are cut. Fuel moves inward. Salt moves outward. Again, one commodity creates demand for another. Production is never isolated. Every industry rests on other industries. A salt pan heated by fire contains a hidden woodland. A metal tool contains a hidden mine. A barrel contains a hidden forest. The town depends on landscapes beyond its streets. Lüneburg's salt becomes particularly important in connection with the northern European trade in fish. Travel north toward the Baltic and North Sea commercial world. Herring is caught, fish is perishable, salt helps preserve it. Preserved fish can travel, markets expand. Now connect the pieces. Salt from one region, fish from another, barrels from another chain of labor, ships, merchants, ports, urban consumers, religious practices that increase demand for fish. The result is not one trade but several trades interlocking. Salt helps make fish more commercially mobile. Fish creates demand for salt. The two industries strengthen one another. This is how an ordinary crystal can help support a commercial network stretching far beyond the town that produces it. Lüneburg becomes associated with the Hanseatic trading world. The Hanseatic League is not a modern nation or a single centralized corporation. It is a shifting network of merchant associations and towns connected by privileges, agreements, interests, and trade across Northern Europe. Its history is complicated, but for our quiet journey, the important point is simple. Cities become powerful when they connect useful things to people who want them. Salt is one of those useful things. A merchant loading salt does not need to understand the entire network. He needs a buyer. A ship owner needs cargo. A fisherman needs preservation. A market seller needs customers. Their separate needs create something larger than any of them. Stand beside a warehouse. Workers move sacks and containers. A clerk records quantities. The air smells of wood, damp rope, animals, smoke, and human labor. Salt is everywhere. No one stops to admire it. That is another sign that we have reached a salt town. What appears exotic to an outsider is ordinary to the people whose wages depend on it. A child growing up here may see salt workers every day. He may hear carts before sunrise. He may know which streets become busiest when shipments arrive. The industry becomes part of the sound of home. This is what a commodity town does. It enters memory. A mining town remembers shifts and tools. A port remembers tides and ships. A salt town remembers brine, smoke, warehouses, carts, and white dust. Economic activity becomes culture simply by repeating long enough. There is also danger in this dependence. A town built around one important commodity can prosper while demand remains strong and production remains competitive. But dependence creates vulnerability. What happens if another source becomes cheaper? What happens if trade routes shift? What happens if political boundaries change? What happens if technology changes? What happens if consumers no longer need as much of the product? The same commodity that helped build the town can eventually become less important. Economic geography is not permanent. A road is useful until another road is better. A port thrives until ships change. A mine operates until extraction becomes too expensive. A salt works survives until cheaper salt arrives from elsewhere. Prosperity contains the possibility of obsolescence. The workers rarely control these changes. A family can spend generations learning one trade. Then the market moves. This is another hidden cost of specialization. Skill creates security while the skill is needed. When demand changes, specialization can become a trap. For centuries, however, salt remains stubbornly useful. The demand is broad enough to support many communities. Travel west now, across the English landscape, salt also leaves marks on place names and roads. Cheshire becomes famous for its brine and salt production. Settlements such as Northwich, Middlewich, and Nantwich develop in landscapes connected to salt. The ending wich or witch in certain English place names is historically associated in some cases with salt-working settlements, though place name history is never as simple as a single rule applied everywhere. Again, language remembers economic geography. A traveller may pass a sign centuries later without realizing the name carries an old industry inside it. In these places, brine can be pumped or drawn and then evaporated. The familiar problem returns. Water must leave. Fuel must be supplied. Labor must be organized. Salt must be transported. Roads become important. Canals later become important. Then railways. Technology changes the route, but the commodity still needs movement. Imagine the difference a canal can make. A horse pulling a boat can move a heavy cargo more efficiently than the same animal hauling carts along poor roads. For a bulky commodity such as salt, this matters enormously. Transport costs fall. Markets become easier to reach. The effective geography of the industry expands. A town once limited by difficult roads can suddenly sell farther away. Infrastructure changes value without changing the product. The salt crystal is identical. The journey becomes cheaper. This is the opposite of what happened in the Sahara there. Difficult transport made distant salt expensive. Here, improved transport can reduce the penalty of distance. Economics is often geography modified by technology. The railway pushes this process further. Heavy cargo can move faster and more predictably. Production can become more concentrated. Markets become larger. Competition between salt-producing regions intensifies. A local producer is no longer competing only with the next town. He may be competing with a source much farther away. The world grows smaller for merchants. Sometimes it grows harsher for workers. Industrialization changes salt production itself. Processes become larger. Equipment becomes more powerful. Companies can organize extraction and distribution on scales that would astonish the medieval worker beside a boiling pan. The commodity begins moving toward the modern condition we recognize today: abundance. consistency, low price, availability. These are extraordinary achievements. They also make the history harder to remember. When salt becomes cheap and dependable, it stops looking important. No one celebrates a supply chain that works perfectly. A person enters a shop. Salt is there. The package is inexpensive. The crystals are clean. The customer carries them home. The entire history of mines, pans, taxes, caravans, smugglers, and political protests seems absurdly distant. This is what successful infrastructure does. It erases the memory of difficulty. Turn on a tap and water appears. Switch on a light and the room brightens. Open a refrigerator and food remains cold. Buy salt and assume salt has always been easy. The modern household is surrounded by solved problems. Because they are solved, they become invisible. But the old salt towns remember. Sometimes the memory is physical. An abandoned industrial building, a mine entrance, a street name, a warehouse converted to another purpose, a depression in the ground, a museum displaying tools once held by tired workers. Sometimes the memory is less comfortable. Salt extraction can change the earth itself. Removing material underground can create instability. Brine extraction can contribute to subsidence in some regions. Buildings crack. Ground shifts. A town built because of what lies beneath it may eventually suffer because so much has been removed. The geology that created prosperity sends an invoice centuries later. This is particularly striking in salt landscapes because salt can dissolve. Water moving through underground deposits can create cavities. Human extraction can alter these processes. Engineering attempts to manage risk, but the earth retains its own logic. A street above may look permanent, the ground below remembers the mine. Again, history hides beneath ordinary life. A family walks to market. Beneath them are old workings. A child goes to school along a road shaped by an industry that began before his grandparents were born. A building leans slightly because the landscape beneath it has changed. The past is not behind them, it is underneath. Return once more to Salzburg. Evening settles over the city. The mountains darken. Lights appear in windows. A visitor hears music and thinks of composers. Another admires churches. Another photographs the river. Few stand in the street thinking about preserved fish or medieval salt revenue. They should not have to. Cities are allowed to acquire new identities. But beneath the elegant image remains an older economic truth. Beautiful places still need boring sources of income. Art requires patrons. Buildings require workers. Institutions require revenue. Wealth must come from somewhere. Sometimes it comes from a white mineral carried down from mountains. The same is true in Lüneburg, in Cheshire, in Hallstatt, in countless smaller settlements whose histories never become famous. Salt creates work. Work creates settlement. Settlement creates institutions. Institutions create memory. Then economic conditions change. The original industry shrinks, the town remains. This may be Salt's most visible monument. Not a golden crown, not a jewel, a place where people still live. There is something appropriate about that. Gold tends to leave spectacular objects. Salt leaves communities. One is preserved behind glass. The other becomes ordinary enough that nobody notices why the street bends where it does. And now our journey approaches the modern world. Refrigeration changes food preservation. Industrial transport changes trade. Chemical industries create new uses for salt on enormous scales. Modern mining and evaporation produce quantities that ancient merchants could scarcely imagine. The old question changes. Salt is no longer valuable because most people struggle to obtain it. In many places, it becomes extraordinarily cheap. A worker can earn enough money to buy more table salt than a medieval household would have treated casually. The commodity once carried across deserts now sits beneath bright supermarket lights. A small package waits on a shelf. No guard, no tax inspector checking a household's legal ration, no caravan, no royal warehouse, no smuggler hiding in the forest, just salt. And this creates the final mystery. How did something powerful enough to build towns, enrich rulers, support trade routes, inspire smugglers, and challenge an empire become so cheap that we barely think about it? The answer is not that salt stopped being necessary. Your body still needs it. Food industries still use enormous quantities. Chemical manufacturing depends on it. Roads in cold climates may consume vast amounts for de-icing. The world uses salt on a scale the ancient miner could hardly imagine. Salt did not become unimportant, it became abundant. Modern extraction became efficient, transport became cheap, supply chains became enormous, the old scarcity weakened, and when scarcity disappears, price can fall even while usefulness remains. This is the final lesson hidden inside every cheap salt shaker. Price is not importance. A thing can be essential and inexpensive. A thing can be useless for survival and extremely costly. Gold and salt have been teaching us this from the beginning. Night settles over the old salt towns. Warehouses become quiet. Some mines are museums now. Some still work. Roads carry trucks where carts once struggled. Rail lines cross landscapes merchants once needed days to traverse. The towns remain, their names remain. The salt remains. But the old world of scarcity is almost gone, so we follow the white crystals one last time. Not toward a king, not toward a caravan, toward a modern table. A hand reaches for a salt shaker without thinking. A few grains fall onto dinner. They cost almost nothing. And hidden inside that careless movement is the entire journey we have taken. The mountain, the Roman road, the medieval winter, the Sahara, the gold market, the salt worker, the tax collector, the smuggler, the march to Dundee. The towns built over brine and rock. All of it ends in a gesture so ordinary that you may have performed it today without remembering any of them. That is where the final story begins. We have followed salt through mountains, roads, kitchens, deserts, tax offices, protests, and towns. Now we arrive somewhere much less impressive, a modern kitchen. There is a table, a chair, a cupboard, perhaps a refrigerator hums softly against one wall. And somewhere nearby is a container of salt. You can pick it up with one hand. You probably do not know where the salt inside it came from. You do not know the name of the person who extracted it. You do not know how many miles it traveled. You may not remember what it cost. That last detail would have seemed strange to many of the people we have met. The medieval household near York knew that salt mattered. The Saharan merchant knew exactly how difficult it was to transport. The French smuggler knew what price differences could mean. The colonial official in India knew salt could produce revenue. The worker beside the brine pan knew how much labor stood behind a pile of crystals. You barely have to think about it. This is not because salt has become useless. It is because the systems surrounding it have become extraordinarily effective. To understand how strange this is, imagine bringing our Hallstatt miner into the modern kitchen. He has spent his life entering a mountain to obtain salt-bearing material. He knows the darkness, the tools, the danger, the labor required to bring useful material toward daylight. Now you open a cupboard. There it is. Clean salt, dry, uniform, packaged, cheap. You tell him that if the container becomes empty, you can obtain another one easily, perhaps within minutes. There is no need to wait for a caravan, no need to know a miner, no need to preserve an entire winter's supply personally, no need to bargain with a merchant who has just crossed dangerous country. You simply buy more. The miner may conclude that you are extremely wealthy. In one sense you are, not because you own more gold than an ancient king, but because you have access to systems that deliver ordinary necessities with a reliability earlier societies could rarely imagine. Modern abundance is a form of wealth that often hides itself. When something is always available, availability stops feeling valuable. The transformation begins long before the modern supermarket. Salt production gradually becomes larger, more organized, and more efficient in many regions. Mining techniques improve, brine extraction changes, evaporation methods develop. Industrial equipment allows producers to handle quantities that would have required enormous labor in earlier periods. Transport changes even more dramatically. Remember the first problem that followed salt through nearly every story. Weight. Salt is heavy. For the Alpine merchant, that meant difficult roads. For the Saharan caravan, it meant camels. For the medieval trader, it meant carts, ships, and barrels. The physical property has not changed. Salt is still heavy. What changes is the cost of moving heavy things. Canals help. A boat can carry large quantities with less resistance than a cart struggling through mud. Then railways transform inland transportation. A locomotive does not become tired halfway up a hill in the way an animal does. It requires fuel, maintenance, track, workers, and enormous investment. But once the network exists, heavy cargo can move farther and more predictably. Salt-producing regions gain access to larger markets. A customer no longer depends only on the nearest source. This increases competition. Competition matters. If one producer charges too much while another can ship salt cheaply into the same market, the expensive producer faces pressure. The local monopoly weakens. Geography has not disappeared. Infrastructure has changed its power. Then roads improve, motor vehicles arrive. Ports become more efficient, ships grow larger. Cargo moves through systems increasingly designed around speed, scale, and predictable scheduling. The ancient price of distance begins to fall. Not to zero, never to zero, but far enough that the old relationship between location and salt becomes much weaker. A household hundreds of miles from a salt source can buy the commodity without feeling those hundreds of miles in the price. This would have seemed almost magical to the Saharan merchant. He spent weeks turning distance into value. Modern logistics works partly by making distance less expensive. The desert still exists, mountains still exist, oceans still exist. But machines carry weight through them. Modern production creates another change. Salt is no longer mainly a household seasoning or preservation tool. It becomes an industrial raw material on an enormous scale. The chemical industry uses salt as a starting material for processes that produce important substances. Chlorine and sodium hydroxide are among the major products associated with the industrial processing of brine. These materials feed into many other industries: manufacturing, paper, textiles, cleaning products, water treatment, plastics, chemical production. The salt shaker on the table represents only a small and familiar corner of a much larger modern salt economy. This is one of history's quieter jokes. Salt becomes less visible at almost the same time humanity begins using immense quantities of it. The ancient household thought constantly about a relatively small supply. The modern industrial economy can consume vast amounts while the ordinary person barely notices. Importance has moved out of sight. Road salt provides an especially strange example. In cold regions, large quantities can be spread across roads to help manage ice. Imagine explaining this to a medieval tax collector. The government takes salt and throws it onto the road, deliberately. Not a few grains, large quantities. The tax collector may assume the civilization has lost its mind. The Saharan merchant may become physically uncomfortable. The French smuggler, who risked punishment to move illegal salt across a boundary, might stare at a truck spreading it across pavement and ask whether he has died and entered some extremely wasteful version of heaven. Yet the modern practice makes economic sense because salt has become cheap enough for the purpose. This is perhaps the clearest measure of how much the world has changed. A commodity once worth carrying across one of the harshest environments on Earth can now be scattered beneath vehicle tires. The chemistry did not change, scarcity did. Modern refrigeration changes salt's relationship with food as well. For much of our journey, preservation gave salt extraordinary importance. A household slaughtering animals before winter needed methods to make food last. A fisherman needed his catch to survive transport. Salt helped create time. Then mechanical refrigeration begins doing something revolutionary. It slows spoilage without requiring food to become heavily salted, dried, smoked, or otherwise transformed in the same way. A refrigerator creates a small artificial climate inside the home. Open the door. Cold air escapes. Food sits inside. This seems completely ordinary now. Historically, it is astonishing. You can keep fresh meat for later without covering it in salt. Milk can remain usable longer under controlled cold conditions. Fish can move through refrigerated supply chains. Frozen food can cross oceans. Seasonal limits weaken. Preservation no longer depends as heavily on salt. The old winter kitchen begins disappearing. Not all at once. Not everywhere. Traditional preservation remains important. Salted foods remain culturally significant. Curing survives because people enjoy the flavor and texture, not only because they have no alternative, but the balance changes. Salt loses part of the strategic importance it once held inside the household. the refrigerator quietly defeats one of its oldest jobs. This is how technologies often change history, not with a dramatic announcement. They make an old problem less serious. Then an entire system built around solving that problem begins to change. Electricity becomes more reliable. Cold storage expands. Refrigerated transport develops. Food supply chains stretch across continents. A person in London can eat products grown far beyond England. A household in York no longer needs to face winter with exactly the same preservation calculations as its medieval ancestors. The seasons remain. The economic meaning of seasons weakens. Freshness can now be manufactured through infrastructure. This changes the emotional meaning of salt. The medieval household sees security. The modern diner sees flavor. That is an enormous cultural shift hidden inside one small container. Salt also becomes standardized. Industrial refining can remove impurities and create consistent crystals for different purposes. Packaging protects the product from moisture and contamination. Anti-caking agents may be used in certain table salts to help crystals flow freely. Iodine can be added to salt as a public health measure. This introduces another remarkable chapter. For most of history, governments taxed salt because its universality made it a convenient source of revenue. In the modern era, that same universality can be used for public health. If almost everyone consumes salt, salt can carry something else to almost everyone. Iodized salt helps address iodine deficiency, which can cause serious health problems. The logic is almost identical to the old tax logic. Find a product widely consumed, attach something to it, reach the population, only the purpose has changed. The king adds a tax, the public health system adds iodine. The same dependable habit supports two very different institutions. Again, salt becomes infrastructure. You use it without thinking about the systems attached to it. The container may carry another clue to modern anxiety. Nutrition information. Salt remains biologically necessary, but excessive sodium intake can contribute to health risks for many people. The historical problem has almost reversed. For much of our journey, the concern is obtaining enough salt at a reasonable price. Modern public health in many places worries that processed diets can contain too much sodium. Scarcity becomes abundance, need becomes excess. A substance can remain essential while overconsumption becomes undesirable. Human beings are remarkably good at solving one problem until a different problem appears. The medieval family worries about food spoiling. Industrial food systems solve much of the storage and distribution problem. Then highly processed foods can make sodium consumption less visible. A person may consume substantial amounts without ever reaching for the salt shaker. The crystal has disappeared into manufacturing. Once again, the commodity hides itself. This is the modern version of the same old story. The buyer sees bread, soup, sauce, cheese, processed meat, a prepared meal. Salt sits inside many products without announcing its history. The worker is hidden, the supply chain is hidden. The chemistry is hidden, the consumer sees dinner. And because salt is cheap, there is little reason to wonder about its origin. Cheapness is one of the most effective forms of historical amnesia. We remember things that are difficult to obtain. When difficulty disappears, memory follows. Imagine a child dropping salt on the floor. A few grains scatter, someone wipes them away. Nothing happens. Now place that scene beside Tagaza. Workers cut heavy blocks from the desert. Camels carry them across immense distances. People manage water carefully. Merchants accept risk. The same substance falls onto a modern floor and is thrown away. The difference is not disrespect, it is abundance. Abundance changes behavior. A society that can replace something easily treats loss differently from a society that cannot. This applies far beyond salt. Clothing becomes disposable when production becomes cheap. Paper becomes ordinary when manufacturing expands. Artificial light becomes invisible when electricity is dependable. Clean water from a tap feels ordinary where infrastructure provides it reliably. The greatest luxuries often stop looking luxurious after everyone gets used to them. Salt may be one of the oldest examples, so was it really once worth more than gold? After this long journey, the answer should now feel less satisfying than the question. Sometimes, in particular places and circumstances, salt could command extraordinary value. Transport across difficult terrain could make it expensive. Local scarcity could make it highly desirable. Political monopolies and taxes could raise legal prices. Historical writers could compare its value with gold in regions where the two moved through very different patterns of supply and demand. But there was never one universal age in which humanity agreed that salt was simply more valuable than gold everywhere. The phrase survives because it compresses a complicated truth into a memorable surprise. The complicated truth is better. Salt could become precious without becoming a precious metal. Its value came from need, from geography, from labor, from transport, from politics, from scarcity. Gold and salt represent two different kinds of wealth. Gold is unusually good at storing value in a compact, durable, socially desired form. Salt is unusually good at being useful. The distinction sounds obvious. History repeatedly shows how powerful it can be. A king can possess gold and still need food. An army can carry treasure and still fail without supplies. A city can display marble while depending on grain and salt arriving every day. A merchant can become rich, carrying necessities no poet would describe as beautiful. Civilizations are built as much from boring things as from spectacular ones, perhaps more. We remember crowns because crowns survive in museums. We do not remember most meals, but the meals kept people alive long enough to make the crowns. This is the quiet reversal at the heart of our journey. Salt was never important because it resembled gold. It was important because it did not. It belonged to everyone. The miner, the soldier, the fisherman's family, the merchant, the monk, the farmer, the wealthy household, the poor household, the tax collector, the smuggler, the protester. Salt moved between social classes because biology ignored social class. That made it commercially powerful, then politically useful, then politically dangerous, and finally, industrially ordinary. Return to the modern table. The salt shaker is still there. Pick it up. A few crystals move inside. The sound is almost nothing. Yet hidden behind that small sound is an enormous history. A miner enters Hallstatt. A merchant walks the Via Salaria. A medieval household prepares for winter. A camel rises beneath a load in the Sahara. Salt reaches markets connected to West African gold. A worker stands beside an evaporation pan. A French smuggler listens for officials in the dark. Gandhi walks toward Dandi. A salt town grows around brine. A railway carries heavy cargo faster than a caravan could imagine. Then the journey contracts into your hand. This is what modern abundance does. It compresses centuries of difficulty into convenience. You do not have to know the road, you do not have to know the producer, you do not have to know the law. The package is simply there. Perhaps that is why salt makes such a useful subject for boring history. It reminds us that boring things are often only important things that have become reliable. We stop noticing them because they work. The road works. The refrigerator works, the supply chain works, the package arrives. The price remains low, and the old anxiety disappears until something fails. A storm closes a road, a supply chain is disrupted, a shortage appears, shelves empty. Suddenly people notice the ordinary object again. Scarcity restores attention with remarkable speed. The lesson has not changed since the first merchant left Hallstatt. Value lives partly in the distance between what people need and what they can easily obtain. Modern systems have made that distance very small for salt. That is why the price fell. Not because salt stopped mattering, because obtaining it became easy. Outside the modern kitchen, evening settles. Somewhere, an industrial mine continues working. Elsewhere, seawater rests in evaporation ponds. A truck carries salt along a highway. A ship moves bulk cargo through darkness. A factory consumes salt in a chemical process. A cook adds a pinch to soup. None of these people needs to know about the others. The network is too large to see from any single point. That is the final form of salt's old invisibility. The ancient customer forgot the miner. The modern customer forgets an entire global system. The salt remains quiet. It has always been good at that. Empires made laws around it. Merchants crossed deserts for it. Workers spent lives producing it. Governments taxed it. People smuggled it. Protesters challenged authority with it. Cities grew beside it. Technology made it cheap. And after all of that, salt asks for no monument. It simply waits beside dinner. A few grains fall. The meal continues. And the treasure disappears into the food. And so after all those roads, we return to the quiet table. The salt is still there. Nothing about it looks important. No camel bells ring in the distance. No miner's lamp moves through a dark mountain. No Roman merchant waits beside the road. No medieval family prepares anxiously for winter. No tax collector opens his ledger. No smuggler listens for footsteps in the night. No marcher walks toward the sea. There is only a small container resting beneath an ordinary light. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the story. For thousands of years, people worked, traded, traveled, argued, taxed, smuggled, and protested over something you can now buy without giving it a second thought. Salt did not lose its usefulness. We simply became very good at finding it, producing it, moving it, and keeping it available. The treasure became ordinary because the difficult parts of its journey slowly disappeared from view. Roads improved, ships grew larger, mines became more productive. Factories transformed production. Railways crossed distances that once exhausted animals. Refrigeration changed the way food survived. Modern supply chains carried heavy goods farther and more cheaply than ancient merchants could have imagined. And gradually, the old white treasure became something sitting quietly beside dinner. Yet beneath every grain remains the memory of another world. A world where winter had to be prepared for carefully, where a mountain deposit could create a settlement, where a block of salt could spend weeks on the back of a camel, where crossing a political boundary with the wrong salt could make someone a criminal, where walking to the sea and lifting salty earth into your hand could become an act of resistance. Gold survives because people preserve it. Salt survives in history for almost the opposite reason. People kept using it again and again. And again, most of it vanished into meals that left no record behind. The kings were written down. The battles were written down. The treaties were written down. But the countless quiet dinners were not. Still, those dinners mattered. History did not happen only in palaces and battlefields. It happened beside cooking fires, in muddy markets, inside smoky workshops, along mountain paths, on fishing boats, beside salt pans shining beneath the sun. It happened whenever an ordinary person tried to make food last a little longer, carry a load a little farther, or survive another winter. Perhaps that is why the history of salt feels strangely familiar. It is really the history of ordinary human needs: food, work, trade, security, money, power, and the endless effort to make tomorrow slightly more predictable than today. So the next time a few grains fall between your fingers, you may remember the mountain at Hallstatt, the old road toward Rome, the cold household near York, the caravan crossing the Sahara, the markets where salt met gold, the workers standing in brine and smoke, the French smuggler moving quietly through darkness, the long road to Dundee, the towns whose streets still carry memories of the salt beneath them. All those journeys now fit inside a single pinch. And perhaps that is enough history for one night. The roads are quiet now. The markets have closed. The fires beside the old salt pans have burned low. The last caravan has disappeared beyond the horizon. Somewhere beneath an alpine mountain, the darkness is still. The Roman road rests beneath centuries of footsteps. The winter rain over York has softened to a whisper. And far beyond the Sahara, the stars remain exactly where tired travelers once looked for direction. You do not need to follow them tonight. You can remain here, warm, still, and comfortable. So dim the lights a little further, if you have not already. Let the old merchants finish their journeys without us. Let the miners put down their tools. Let the camels rest. Let the waves move quietly onto the shore. And let history become distant again. Thank you for spending this long, quiet journey with me. If you enjoyed it, you can leave a comment telling me where in the world you were listening from. And if these slow journeys into the forgotten corners of history help you relax, you can subscribe and join me again for another one. But for now, there is nowhere else we need to go. The salt is on the table. The road is empty. The fire is almost out. And the past can wait until morning. Good night.